I will not begin with vengeance. I will begin with breath, the kind you draw before a bout, the kind that steadies the hand and slows the heart. My name, as some taverns still remember, is Inigo Montoya. If you listen closely, the sea outside this window strikes the rocks with the same rhythm my father's hammer once struck steel. Steady, patient, purposeful. It is a good rhythm for an invitation. We will be gentle at first. There will be swordplay later, and masks, and corridors where torchlight leans toward the floor like a spectator. For now, come in, sit, and let me set the blade on the table between us, harmless as a line of ink. Here is the first truth. No one enters a fairy tale through the front gates. You find a crack in the wall, a side door the keepers do not watch. That is where I slipped in Never the Prince, not even the squire, only the boy who learned to bow to a furnace, because a furnace taught him how metal listens. In the village of my childhood we had few titles, but careful names, and we kept them polished by work. My father, Domingo, polished his with filings and fire. Once, this matter she forged a sword for a noble with 6 fingers. My father measured the balance until it seemed to float between his hands. He smiled the way craftsmen smile when their work meets an ideal. You already know that what followed was not an ideal. Let us not dwell there yet. Beginnings deserve their own air. If this were a different sort of tale, thunder would sign its name across the sky, and I would make my vow in a blaze of poetry. But the day disaster came was bright, and the loudest sound was laundry flapping on the line. I was a boy with a wooden practice blade and a head full of the names of masters, Bonetti, Capoferro, Thibault, Agrippa names, like stepping stones across a river I had not yet forded. When the nobleman's temper proved sharper than his honour, the world narrowed to the shock of what anger can do to a room that held only respect a moment before. Grief is an impatient teacher. I learned footwork as if the floor might disappear. I learned to breathe as if breathing might be taken away. A sword, strangely, can teach a person to be tender. The edge instructs restraint. The point teaches emphasis. The weight insists on patience. A parry is a kind of listening, a riposte, a courteous reply. I kept the blade clean and tried to keep the mind cleaner. And because life is rarely generous, I discovered early that coins favour spectacle over skill. A flashy flourish wins applause. A clean defence wins the esteem of 2 or 3 quiet souls, and no bread. So I hired out my arm where I could duel here. Escort there until employment found me in the shape of a Sicilian strategist, and a giant whose footsteps sounded like second chances. Vizzini had the sort of intelligence that mistakes speed for certainty. Fezzik had hands like harbour walls, and a kindness that made bad nights gentler. We were 3 pieces from different games tumbled into the same pocket. We performed for patrons who liked danger at a distance. On other evenings we sold our talents to those who measured risk the way other people measure wine. You may ask if my ledger had a column for conscience. It did. It still does. When Vizzini spoke of a princess, a small boat, and a moon that would tell no tales, my pen hesitated over the page. Hesitation is not a refusal, but it is not nothing. It is a hinge. It can swing either way. Later, buttercup eyes. that was her name, stood upon our deck with the poise of someone who has not chosen anything in a very long time. I recognize that posture. It is the stance of a life arranged by others. I could not yet rescue her. I could at least make the ropes neat and the knots honest. A man does what he can in the moment given. If you are waiting for a justification, you are listening well. This is not absolution, it is inventory. Fezzik softened the dark with couplets. Vizzini arranged reasons like chessmen and called it inevitability. I brewed tea, inspected my blade, and told myself that the world is wide and simple acts are complicated by the histories inside them. Perhaps you are not a swordsman. Perhaps your battles look like email threads and traffic and the way a kettle takes forever when you are late. Keep listening. Craft is craft. You have your Bonettis and your Agrippas, to the small disciplines that keep you from sinking into the quicksand of noise. There were days I wanted to abandon practice and sell the sword for a warm coat. On those days I remembered my father's hands red at the knuckles, gentle on the hilt, and I would step, lunge, recover, again and again, until the floorboards learned my cadence and the room remembered its purpose. You have heard, I think, of the cliffs that some call of insanity. I prefer to call them of perspective, because height clarifies the scale of our pride. That is where the man in black would follow us, fingers biting stone, rope hissing, the sea arguing with itself below. I waited at the summit, by agreement and by desire, because a true duel is a conversation in steel, and conversations are better face to face. I even helped him up, which surprised him and pleased me. Courtesy is a weapon opponents rarely prepare for. When you offer it, you open them in a place their armor does not cover. But that is ahead. Tonight is for beginnings, for the scent of charcoal and oil, for the scrape of a whetstone, for the memory of a sword so balanced it made even grief stand straighter. Tonight is for admitting that I have been both villain and companion, and that the story still welcomed me, because stories are more hospitable than courts and cleverer than kings. They notice who tries. They grant rehearsals. They give cowards a second entrance and braggarts a quieter line. There is a corridor I will speak of later, carpeted, silent lit, as if the torches were afraid to breathe where a certain noble kept his study and his secrets. I have walked it in dreams more times than I can count. Yet even there, when memory sharpens, I find that laughter saves me. Fezzik's enormous whisper, Vizzini's impossible arithmetic, a miracle that tasted like a chocolate-coated pill. Curses live a long time. Comedy lives longer. It loosens the grip of fate just enough for a hand to slip free. But we still wonder whether the tale we tell ourselves about revenge is only a borrowed cloak costume, not clothing, and whether friendship or love, or even the ridiculous bravado of a masked rescuer, is the better tailor. Before the torches brighten and the violins clear their throats, pause with me. Take a sip of whatever is warm at hand. Let your shoulders lower a single unheroic inch. Look at a window and count to 6 without hurry. There already the world is less inclined to shove. I promise you this, I will handle the sharp edges while you handle the listening. When the man in black reaches the ledge where I wait, we will bow like gentlemen, and our blades will speak their quick, bright syllables. For tonight, breathe and step with me to the lip of the cliff, where a fairy tale changes from rumour into fact. The forge is a chapel that sings when you ask kindly. That is how I remember my father's shop. The bellows like a patient chorister, the anvil a pew that welcomed every penitent blade, the coals giving homilies in orange. My earliest lessons were liturgical in their sequence: fuel, air, fire, tatu, steel, quench, temper, test, polish. To a child, these were spells that turned stubborn awe into a line so clean it could divide an argument from an insult. Inigo Montoya treated steel as if it had opinions and the right to be persuaded, not bullied. We do not force a blade, he would say. We introduce it to itself. When the commission came, it arrived wrapped in manners and money. A nobleman with 6 fingers, he wore gloves so well that you noticed only after the greeting sent his man with measurements and a purse that felt like a compliment. Father held the parchment with the instructions and nodded the way navigators nod to a difficult coast. He did not crow or court flattery. He cleared the workbench and laid a white cloth upon it, because the beginning of any task deserves dignity. If you have ever rearranged your desk before tackling a hard letter, you know that reverence. It steadies the room and tells your hands not to hurry. A sword is a sentence you intend to say once and say right. For weeks I watched my father test alloys like a poet testing syllables. He made mock-ups, then melted them back into anonymity when their balance faltered a hair. He marked a chalk line along the bench and rolled each blank across it to listen for whispers of warp. Craftsmen hear disapproval where others hear silence. On certain mornings, he brought the blank to the open door to let the Atlantic lay a breeze along it, as though salt air could bless the grain. Blades remember their first weather, he told me. So let it be honest weather. We practiced footwork in the narrow space between the quench tub and the wall, my wooden practice sword touching his cane in deliberate hieroglyphs: engage, disengage, feint, recover. When I faltered, he told me to watch the ember that burned longest in the brazier, not the bright one that shouted. Balance, he insisted, lives in the quieter light. If this sounds like philosophy, it is merely the sort that sneaks into a shop where a man loves his craft. We spoke little, but the anvil kept time like a metronome. Even now, when streets grow loud, I find a rhythm in the memory, and my thoughts stand in line. The day the blade first took its full shape, my father's face revealed a private relief I had seen only once on the afternoon I lost a tooth, and he pretended to trade it for a coin while hiding fear for my fever. He cradled the sword at the balance point and smiled, not broadly, but with the contentment of adequate truth. He finished the guard with a small flourish in the quillons, the curve suggesting a question mark so faint you might only feel it with your thumb. Every good weapon, he told me, leaves room for a question. We laughed then, because in that house even our jokes were careful. If you are wondering whether a boy can love a blade without growing cruel, I will answer yes, if the blade is loved for its listening. Father taught me that steel hears posture, hears breath. On rainy afternoons he made me stand, eyes closed, feeling the weight settle through the wrist to the elbow, down the shoulder into the heel. The hand is not a throne, Inigo, he would say, tapping my forearm. It is a threshold. In evenings, when the village smudged into blue and neighbours smoked in doorways, He would polish until the sword wore a softness rather than a shine, a finish like calm water at dusk. Our liturgy had worldly interludes. The bill for the coal, the cost of good leather for the grip, the purse dwindling as any honest purse will. My father, who could be fiercer with a misaligned fuller than with a taxman, turned bookkeeper by candlelight. I, who preferred lunges to numbers, learned that dignity also means letting arithmetic revise your dreams without souring them. If you have ever budgeted for groceries while your heart typed a poem, I recognize you as kin. Craft is a stubborn kindness. It keeps us awake to reality while making reality gentler to bear. The nobleman's steward returned for a fitting. He carried his master's glove like a standard, the extra finger folded so neatly that you could almost believe it was an aristocratic quirk of tailoring. My father placed the unfinished sword in the man's hands. A craftsman sees in the first lift whether a pairing will be marriage or mistake. The steward nearly smiled. It balances like a thought, he said, and for a moment the shop seemed to float. We spoke of minor adjustments, the leather wrap, the guard's throat, the exact pitch of the blade's sweet spot, and set a date for delivery. When the man left, my father did not celebrate. He tightened a small screw on the pommel, then loosened it again, worrying it like a rosary bead. Perfection is not pride. It is responsibility wearing modest clothes. Only once did he name the buyer directly. Count Rugen, he said, tasting each syllable with the care he gave steel. Then, with the simple courtesy he owed any patron, he added, "May he use it wisely." In our home, that wish was not naive, but ceremonial. Like salt on the table or water beside the bed, we blessed what we made because blessing keeps the maker from believing he alone controls the fate of a thing. I would learn later how small our control truly was. But that is a door I will not open yet. I must tell you about the handle. My father wrapped it in leather, dyed the brown of wet bark, then stitched a seam so fine it felt like a memory rather than a thread. At the guard's base, he inlaid a narrow strip of nickel that caught the light just enough to say hello to the eye without courting it. When he finally etched his maker's mark near the Ricasso Domingo M, he did it with a breath held and a pause afterward, as if signing a treaty. I did the small, unglorious tasks, sweeping, oiling, running to the dock for more charcoal, answering the door with a bow that would not embarrass us. And at night, I cleaned my wooden practice blade and set it beside the real one, as if the two could teach each other in their sleep. It may seem to you a gentle chapter, all shavings and light, yet under it ran a current as firm as the anvil's base, a son preparing to inherit more than skill, a husbanded calm before a change in weather. On the evening the Count was due, my father dressed not richly, but correctly. Fresh shirt, vest without fray, hands scrubbed to the cuticles, the quiet pride of a man ready to hand over both work and wish. He rehearsed the lift once more, placed the sword back upon the cloth, and told me to bring in the good chair. People sit more truthfully, he said, when a chair does not ask them to perform. If you have ever waited for a door knock that might turn labour into livelihood, you know the hush that gathers in the lungs. Fezzik once told me that in the wrestling ring there is a silence right before the second bell that makes a giant feel small. In a forge, the same hush makes a son feel taller Because a father's trust adds inches no tailor can measure. I set water to boil, not because a count would drink our tea, but because steam is company when nerves begin to crowd. And I polished the good chair's top rail with my sleeve until it shone just enough to say we had tried. But we still wonder whether a perfect object can protect the imperfect people who make it, or if beauty, like courtesy, is only a strong beginning. A promise that the world, invited politely, might choose to be kind. If this chapter has felt like watching someone threading a needle in slow light, take comfort. Life is a long garment sewn of such minutes. Sending a careful email, fixing the wobble in a kitchen chair, choosing to listen an extra beat before replying, these are the small stitches that keep the seams from bursting when the weather turns. My father taught me that. I am, at best, his apprentice still. The knock did come. I remember my hand moving toward the latch, the steam blessing my face, my father's eyes the steady as a plumb line. I remember the door opening onto a heraldic smile and the sort of courtesy that glitters like a curtain. What passed next will belong to another part, another breath. For now, keep the image. A blade perfected, a chair honest, a craftsman ready to surrender what he loved to the person who asked for it. There are few gestures more courageous than that. The Count's herald stepped aside and let the room rearrange itself around his master. It is a talent of certain men. Furniture makes way, air stands straighter, even the teapot mindfully keeps quiet. He removed his glove with a flourish, so unhurried you notice the detail only afterward, the extra finger, pale and perfectly ordinary in its own strange arithmetic. 6 is not a monstrous number until it appears at the end of a hand. My father bowed with the modest dignity of a man who has already offered his best. I bowed because a son's knees learn the choreography of his father's respect. Domingo, the Count said, and made my father's name sound like a borrowed object. He picked up the blade properly. I will grant him that, testing the balance without teasing it. Some men wag a sword as if it were a bell they hope to make confess. He lifted, let the weight settle, turned the wrist once enough to coax, not enough to bully. The sword answered like a well-bred sentence. Clear subject, honest verb, no unnecessary adjectives. For a breath or two I saw in his face the pleasure any human feels when a tool meets his intention. Price unromantic, but real entered the room as it must. The Count's steward named a lesser number, my father named the fair one. The Count, smiling like a man in on a private joke, suggested that the honour of making such a blade was payment beyond coin. There are compliments that arrive in silk and leave a bruise. My father's smile hardened along the edges. He did not lecture. He repeated the price as one repeats a proverb that has survived rain. The Count's eyes cooled by a degree. I remember thinking, ridiculously, that if I could nudge the good chair a finger width to the left, tension might leak harmlessly into the floorboards. If memory were a lens I could adjust, I would soften the next minutes until they blurred into a quarrel of gestures. But memory, unfair as gravity, fixes one or two details and lets them anchor everything else. I recall there was sunlight made a coin shine in the steward's palm like an argument. I recall the elegant boredom with which the Count rescinded warmth. I recall my father's hand, open but steady, a craftsman's hand refusing to learn a cheaper alphabet. The words that followed were sharp enough so to cut, but not lurid. They entered the shop, did their work, and left, taking with them the possibility that respect would be the final language spoken that day. I will not recount harm for its own sake. I will tell you what it made. A vow, the shape of a life, and a footpath I followed until my soles remembered it better than streets. My father fell as suddenly as a tool dropped from a careless height, and the room so full of order a moment before became a place where breath had to relearn its task. I said words then that a boy says when he is trying to make the world promise to stop being itself. If I could have hammered time back onto the anvil, I would have. Lacking that, I swore an oath to the man with 6 fingers, to his name, to the pattern of his footsteps, to the way politeness can be weaponized until it is almost indistinguishable from scorn. People imagine revenge as a fire. I found it to be a map. I traced routes on tavern tables with spilled wine. I practiced until my hands ached and my feet kept ghost-stepping in my sleep. I listened for rumours the way sailors read wind. And when news was stingy, I learned patience, that unremarkable virtue that keeps soups from burning and careers from curdling. If you have ever waited for a leaky faucet to drip once more so you can measure the interval, you know my curriculum. I counted, I timed, I refined. The world did not hurry for me. It rarely does. Teachers arrived as they do when a student refuses to leave. In a convent yard carved out of wind, a woman who moved like a shutter close at dusk taught me to be invisible between blinks. In a city where the streets thought themselves alleys, an old man whose hands trembled at breakfast and never again until nightfall taught me to let the opponent announce himself in the way he reached for his glass. A fisherman with a scar that looked like a hyphen told me to watch for hesitation. A man's first uncertain syllable says more than his boasting paragraphs. Some demanded payment in coin, others asked only for company, a bottle, or the pleasure of naming the masters aloud in order. Bonetti for tempo, Capoferro for position, Thibault for geometry, Agrippa for humility. I never became pious about doctrine. Every system is a ladder. Ladders are for climbing, not worship. What I kept was a toolbox of postures, a lexicon of angles, the habit of greeting each new blade as a person and not a problem. I sparred in arenas that smelled of beer and in courtyards that smelled of clipped boxwood. I lost often, at first cleanly, then gracefully, then less and less. Defeat, it turns out, is a detail teacher. It marks the spot where your attention wandered. Sometimes I laughed when I should not have, as when a duke's cousin tripped over his own ego and begged me not to tell his ego about it. Sometimes I treated myself to bread too fine for my purse. We must befriend ourselves on the road. It is exhausting travel otherwise. There were days the vow felt like a coat that no longer fit too tight in the shoulders, too short at the wrist. I would see a goose girl cracking jokes with a baker's boy and wonder whether the world's simplest happiness had a price I could afford. Then a rumour would find me, a court where a certain man was said to favour gloves even in summer, an account of a duel finished before the witnesses agreed it had begun, a whisper of a corridor with carpets so thick steps became secrets. I followed such whispers like a pilgrim follows bells. Sometimes they led me to dead ends and good dinners, sometimes only to to dead ends. But every now and then a door would open a crack, and the light beyond would be the precise colour of information. I told you that a sword is a sentence you intend to say once and say right. Over the years, I learned the grammar of enemies. Some require declarative force, some respond to a question, some must be interrupted kindly but firmly before they waste your afternoon. When I think of the Count now, I do not see a demon. I see a man whose habits arranged themselves into a fortress that kept out anything like mercy. Perhaps if he had known how to misplace a book or spill soup on his sleeve, the citadel would have had a door I could knock on. Perfection is a loneliness that teaches itself to pass for superiority. On the practical side, I ate where I could, sewed the same rip in my cloak 3 times, and learned to dry my boots by stuffing them with paper rather than holding them to the fire. You who manage fridges and school runs and meetings that could have been letters, I tell you truly, the heroic life requires the same dull competences as the ordinary one. Keep the receipts, tie the knot you can untie later, sharpen before you are dull, rest before you are desperate. I speak as a swordsman and as a man, who once burned breakfast because he was practicing footwork while the pan whispered for help. But we still wonder whether a vow, no matter how clean its beginnings, can remain a compass without becoming a cage, and whether the face we imagine at the end of our road will be human enough to surprise us into something kinder than the plan. Years later, years lined with the chalk of practice and the ink of maps, a rumour with a sharper edge found me near a harbour where the gulls sounded like children inventing laws for a game. A prince in a small kingdom had a new favourite at court, a man with pale hands and a habit of walking the corridors after midnight. He kept a private study where mirrors faced one another so the room multiplied, and the visitor felt watched by an ancestry of selves. I felt the old vow tighten like a bootlace. I bought a comb, cut my hair to decency, and went to listen to the walls. I will not pretend I met him then. Stories love coincidence. Life loves preparation. I learned the pattern of the guards' yawns, the weight of the gates at dusk, the schedule of the kitchen's onion tears. I learned the name of a seamstress who fixed a tear in a velvet doublet and cursed the owner's pettiness, though she admired his taste in metalwork. I smiled at that. Taste in metalwork is the most honest thing about many men. I slept little and dreamed narrowly. When I finally saw him down a hallway that had the privacy of a thought spoken aloud, my body knew it before my mind did. Certain presences rearrange your blood-like furniture. The glove, the extra finger, the gaze that counted and discounted in the same motion. There he was. I say this calmly, because the moment did not explode. It arrived the way a key arrives at the right door quietly, with the liberality of inevitability. I did not speak the famous words a boy had written in his head years before. Not yet. Words, too, require distance and angle. I let him pass. I measured his stride. I measured my fear and found it compatible with courage. Then I turned away, not because I had renounced the vow, but because the sentence was not yet ready to be said once and said right. A vow sharpens a man. Hunger employs him. After the hallway where I measured the 6-fingered stride, I learned the arithmetic of access. Court walls are thicker than hatred, and corridors do not open for oaths. I needed time, and time requires bread. The sea told me so in its blunt syllabus: pay for a room, pay for a meal, pay for the privilege of waking up one more morning with your practice intact. Fate is romantic only at a distance. Up close, it keeps a ledger. I met Fezzik first, which is to say, I met gentleness wearing the size of a door. He was lifting casks at a harbour where the gulls sounded argumentative, and a crew sang just enough of a tune to agree on the chorus. His hands had a way of cupping large things as though they were afraid, not heavy. He hummed, then apologetically rhymed to the rhythm of his work, couplets that scuffed like old shoes. Lift the barrel, mind the lip, don't let kindness lose its grip. You may laugh, I did, but the rhyme, like his grip, kept the day from slipping. When a rope snapped and a cask lurched toward a boy too small to understand physics, Fezzik intercepted it with the casual precision of a librarian catching a falling sentence. He set the cask down, patted the boy's hair as if returning a hat, and apologized to the rope for startling it. I have known many strong men. Only one ever apologized to a rope. He noticed my sword, the way school teachers notice verbs professionally. You are good, he said, not as flattery, but as weather. You practice. I liked him instantly. Some friendships open like a door you did not know was unlocked. He offered me bread before asking my name. There are questions that answer themselves. Vizzini arrived in the manner of headaches and opportunities. He was Sicilian in the sense that he made geography sound like a strategy and appetite like a proof. He spoke faster than the air could cool his words. I have seen fishmongers fillet an argument with less efficiency. You, giant, he said to Fezzik, and you, Spaniard, yes? Yes, the blade. We will discuss the blade in a minute. Do you enjoy employment that fits your talents and offends only those who deserve it? He smiled without committing to the definition of deserve. I do not insult his mind. It was extraordinary at a certain angle, the way a mirror can be brilliant if you do not ask it to be a window. He laid out a plan with pebbles on a wine-stained table, a small kingdom, an impending royal marriage, a princess whose name, Buttercups, seemed designed to annoy cynics, a political appetite for misdirection. A kidnapping, he said lightly, like a man proposing a change of hat. No blood. The threat of it, yes. The theatre of it, certainly. But no mess. We are civilized technicians. He tapped a pebble where the sea would be. The cliffs, he added, with the affection a mathematician reserves for a particularly elegant problem. We ascend at night. Rope, harness, Uto me will ensure that any pursuit does not involve points and edges. Uto Fezzik will lift when lifting must be done, and rhyme when morale requires it. People underestimate morale. I cannot pretend my ledger's conscience column did not twitch. A princess is a person, not a pebble. Yet the plan's edges did not glitter with murder. They shone with theatre. And theatre, I told myself, is a cousin to deception that still sends notes home to decency. I had seen enough of courts to know how power arranges innocence as scenery. If we were props in someone else's play, did it matter which set we stood on? This is how a hungry man argues with his better self and wins on a technicality. Fezzik looked at me, then at Vizzini. Will there be time for lunch? He asked. Kidnappings go better if no one is faint. Vizzini waved off the detail. He always waved off the details that kept people human and said, "Food is logistics, and logistics is victory." Then he leaned close, the way cats lean close to warm bowls, and whispered, "It will be." He paused for emphasis. He lived on emphasis. Inconceivable, his favourite word, offered like a charm against uncertainty. I would hear it many times. It rarely meant what he thought it did, but it gave him courage. And courage in any dialect is still courage. We practiced for the climb on a warehouse wall, which is to say, we learned to trust rope, knots, and each other's mistakes. Practice is the art of scheduled embarrassment. Physics rhymes terrible and tender regulated our breathing. Left hand, right hand, do not slip. Friendship is a better grip. He always reddened after a couplet, as if the rhyme had committed a social error and needed shelter. I tested knots until my fingers ached and my patience improved. Vizzini supervised with the impatience of a mind that considered friction a personal insult. "We are not making history," he snapped when my knot took too long. "We are making punctuality." On the night itself, the moon kept an honest watch. A coin laid on the dark. Buttercup stood on our deck with the stillness of a person who has mistaken surrender for serenity. I approached her with the courtesy swordsmanship had taught me. Ask permission. Announce your touch. Treat proximity as a loan. "Do you require water?" I asked. "Do you require anything?" She looked past me as though the horizon were taking attendance and did not wish to be marked present. I did not take offence. Not every sentence requires you in its grammar. I checked the ropes again. I checked my blade. When you cannot fix the world, you can at least tidy the instruments. If you have ever done a job whose morality depended on details editing a contract so it cannot be abused, supervising a game so the rules are truly fair, you know the intensity that descends when the first step can't be taken back. My stomach practiced knots while my hands unpracticed them. Fezzik lifted Vizzini as if he weighed as much as a hypothesis. We began the ascent. The rope hummed like a low song. The cliffstone breathed cold and old. Halfway up, Vizzini muttered that the climb was inconceivable, which of course proved it was occurring. Fezzik, to comfort the words as much as the muscles, offered, "Climb steady, climb slow. You cannot rush a shadow." I resisted a laugh that would have shaken the rope. We reached the summit, hearts sinking to the sea's metronome below. I watched the horizon as if it could raise a hand if danger approached. Danger did. A small shape separated from the coast's dark and followed our line like a syllable after a breath. "Someone climbs," I said. Vizzini frowned as a man frowns at an insult to his arithmetic. "Inconceivable," he replied, then considered the evidence and amended, "Conceivable, but inconvenient." He assigned me to remain and deal with the pursuer once he reached the top. His tone suggested that dealing would prefer elegance to noise. Fezzik squeezed my shoulder, a pressure that felt like a promise rather than advice. When the man in black finally swung into reach, I did the impractical thing because I am a practical romantic. I helped him up. There is a protocol among craftsmen. We bow to skill even as we prepare to oppose it. "Rest a moment," I said, meaning it. The cliff taxed even pride. He declined rest with a politeness that sounded like mischief that had gone to school and graduated with honours. We agreed to duel properly, on level ground, with respect for the blade as a translator between us. Vizzini would have called this inefficient. I called it civilization. Buttercup watched from a distance with the curiosity of someone encountering a language she had not known she knew. But we still wonder whether chivalry is courage or only vanity freshly pressed, and whether making space for honour in a wicked plan redeems the plan or merely flatters the participants. Before we crossed blades, Fezzik retreated after Vizzini, carrying our equipment as if it contained fragile weather. I took my stance and introduced my steel with a small salute to the knight. The man in black saluted in return. "You seem a decent fellow," he said. "I hate to kill you." "You seem a decent fellow," I answered, the truth enjoying itself. "I hate to die." The exchange heard later around 100 tavern tables was not bravado, but grammar, the kind two craftsmen use to conjugate respect. We drew nearer to the bright, quick syllables of sword. If all this sounds theatrical, remember that theatre is the rehearsal room of courage. You who return emails with courtesy even when you have been wronged. You who cook simply but well for people who will not remember the menu. You who hold a door in a world in a hurry. Do not discount your stage. Practice writes character. Character steadies the wrist. We bow, we breathe, we begin. The ground at the cliff's crown offered just enough room for honesty. I cleared a few pebbles with the side of my boot, the way a priest might straighten a candle before prayer. The man in black rolled his shoulders once, economical, as if confirming that every hinge and tendon had signed the attendance sheet. We saluted. The knight held the blade's first syllable in its lungs. Our opening was bonetti for tempo, the conversational hello of swordsmanship. He pressed the measure, neat as a ledger. I allowed it, curious about his punctuation. The steel spoke in quick, bright notes. When he tried a capo ferro line, I met it with Tybalt's geometry. And because joy is a better ambassador than pride, I smiled. He noticed. "You're very good," he said, half statement, half invitation. "I am," I replied, not to boast, but to set the table properly before serving what I had saved for dessert. I am left-handed, which in a world built for the other hand often feels like walking against a polite crowd. I had fought dozens of men who learned to read my angles slowly and lost their patience before they found their education. The man in black did not hurry. He adapted in small crescents of insight. The ground, sensitive as an audience, adjusted its silence to admire him. When he claimed the center line with a neat bind, I gave him an obstacle. I let my blade drift just enough to invite a mistake and watched him decline the invitation. It made me like him more. We circled toward the cliff's lip and away from it, two polite planets testing the gravity between us. My feet spelled sentences on the stone. I tried a feint borrowed from a teacher whose name I never knew, an old trick that works mostly because it is earnest. He replied with an answer too clean to resent. A few more passes proved the arithmetic. With my right hand idle, he was not outmatched, but he was writing in a borrowed dialect. That was the moment to alter the grammar. "I am not left-handed," I told him, and shifted the blade to my right. The movement small, private, like switching a cup to the familiar hand. It is an impolite line unless offered gently. I offered it gently. The air changed. The blade in my preferred grip became a sentence I had revised for years. Suddenly fluent. The world sharpened into a corridor I could walk with my eyes closed. Closing speed, angle, the tolerant hum of good steel. I pressed, not cruelly but sincerely, to test whether he could read at this pace. He could, first with difficulty, then with a clarity that made me feel the rare companionship of being understood by an opponent. His parries stopped being guesses and became replies. A small grin the kind skilled people share when consulting the same secret book appeared beneath his mask. There is no audience like a worthy enemy. You perform in the finest sense. I made a slow, high disengage. He answered with a lunge so precisely measured my ribs applauded. We traded initiative like hosts, insisting the other take the better chair. Then he said the line that belonged to him. I am not left-handed either. He switched hands, and the ground-loyal but honest withdrew a fraction of its confidence from me and gave it to him. The change was not thunder, it was a hinge. Suddenly his blade wrote in its natural script. I caught, parried, retreated a hair's breadth to find the new music. He did not rush to capitalize. He gave me the courtesy of learning the updated vocabulary before he spoke in full paragraphs. Some men, given advantage, become noisy. He became accurate. What do you do when the world tilts politely against you? You listen harder. I shortened my movements, paid interest on each inch, avoided the temptation to dramatize the moment with desperate flourishes. A bad defeat writes a messy story. A good one edits you. He bound my blade with a tenderness that said, no harm if you yield, honor if you fight on. I fought on. The cliff kept its counsel. Buttercup watched in a stillness that suggested a memory being made. I thought absurdly of my father's maxim about quieter embers. He took the center, lost it, retook it, not with dominance, but with familiarity. I tried the old fisherman's hesitation trick. Begin a feint. Show the ghost of commitment. Vanish into a real line. But the man in black did not chase ghosts. He waited for evidence. When I gave it, he used it. The exchange that followed felt like a conversation in which both parties decide truth is more interesting than victory. He disarmed me, not with a wrenching cruelty, but with a precise, dismaying, elegant steel left my hand as if excused from class. He did not kill me. He did not even scar me. He left me on the ground with my breath intact and my oath unmocked, nodding as if we had just finished a difficult piece of chamber music and agreed to play it better next time. Mercy, when given by someone competent to refuse it, is a form of authorship. He chose the next chapter for me. I would live to write in it. If this disappoints you, if you hoped for blood and exclamation points, I must remind you we are keeping company with a story that trusts wit over gore and grace over spectacle. The man in black had a purpose larger than humiliation. Buttercup had a future larger than a cliff. Fezzik had rhymes to finish. Vizzini had schemes to misinterpret. My path, though kinked by defeat, still ran toward a corridor with muffled carpets and a certain hand in a certain glove. I will not pretend I enjoyed losing. It pinched pride in places pride keeps secret. Yet even as I stared up at a sky the colour of well water and catalogued the small aches that prove a body is not a rumour, I felt gratitude. There are defeats that return your name to you, to be measured precisely, no more, no less is a kind of respect you cannot buy. It is the relief of realizing that somewhere in the world your skill has a twin that wears a different mask. If you need a gentler parallel, if your battles are fought in inboxes and kitchens, think of the meeting where your idea was improved by a colleague you cannot help admiring. Think of the recipe you cooked according to the book, and only then learned how to bend it. Think of the project you delivered, late but right, and how the apology tasted like honesty, not ash. Defeat without humiliation is instruction. With a hand on your shoulder, not a finger in your face. Brew a cup of tea. Stretch your back. Admit a better method exists. Tomorrow you will move cleaner. I stood, eventually. My sword lay in the dust with the dignity of a tool that has not betrayed you, only told the truth. I picked it up and checked the edge out of habit. It remained itself. I promised it not aloud, but in the pact of touch that we would practice with kinder rigour. Then I followed the path after Fezzik, my feet reacquainting themselves with purpose. The man in black walked away without theatrics. He had saved my life, which is to say he had saved my vow, which is to say he had saved my father again, in a manner Domingo would have understood, through craft. But we still wonder whether the self we meet in triumph is less trustworthy than the self we meet in loss, and whether the finest victories are merely defeats translated by gratitude into a dialect we can live with. Down from the cliffs, the land gentled into fields that speculated about harvests and a road that believed in destinations. Somewhere ahead, the Sicilian would try to trap inevitability with logic, and later a prince would decorate fear with ceremony. I walked steady, not fast, because a pace you can keep is a better ally than a sprint you cannot finish. The night smelled of stone, rope, and a little salt. I breathed, catalogued my errors, treasured the stranger's courtesy, and carried onward the sentence I had sworn to say once and say. Right. You learn a man's measure not only by how he wins, but by how he chooses his field. After the duel, while my lungs traded complaints with the sea, Fezzik hurried along the ridge to intercept the man in black further on. He disliked hurting anyone as a matter of policy. Bodies, he once told me, are where people keep their feelings. But he loved a fair contest, and fairness to him meant clarity, even ground, no tricks, both parties agreeing on the rules like neighbours agreeing where a fence should stand. I followed at a respectful distance. One does not intrude on a friend's courage, the way one does not interrupt a craftsman counting beats. The cliff narrowed into a plateau tufted with scrub, and there Fezzik waited, hands open, face hopeful in that particular way only large, gentle men manage like a sky hoping to remain blue. The man in black arrived without hurry, blade sheathed, the tilt of his head suggesting a willingness to entertain an unfamiliar chapter. Fezzik cleared his throat. I prefer no rocks, he said, nodding toward a scatter of stones as if accusing them of ambition. Just hands. The man in black looked pleased by the civil terms. He removed his sword-belt with a courtliness that would have impressed a table full of sceptical aunts, and said something dry about inconvenience, which in his dialect meant, "I will do it your way. If you have only seen wrestling as theatre, you miss its grammar." Fezzik wrote in paragraphs, always beginning with a polite introduction grip that did not bruise, weight that warned rather than punished. The man in black replied with commas and dashes, short adjustments, the body's small punctuation. Fezzik smiled at each clever escape the way a teacher smiles at a student's surprising verb, then tightened gently, always gently, until the sentence would hold no more revisions. It should have ended there, with a nap and gratitude. But the man in black owned a stubbornness I recognized in mirrors. He refused a nap. He borrowed air from the edges of the world and wriggled between muscle and intent, as if slipping through an unstitched seam. At last, Fezzik's arms went slack, not out of malice received, but of air mislaid. He staggered, sat, breathed again, and grinned sheepishly. "You are good," he told the dark, "and I am in need of lunch." I arrived then and lifted his enormous wrist the way a child might lift the corner of a curtain. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "Only in my rhyme," he said. "I thought of, 'Don't forget to breathe, Fezzik please ek,' and it was no help at all. I laughed because he wanted me to, and because laughter takes the thorns off disappointment when taken promptly. He insisted I go on after them. "You have better feet," he shrugged. "Also, Vizzini is about to begin talking." He meant it kindly. We both respected Vizzini's mind, but the Sicilian loved his voice the way some men love mirrors. I went. A ridge funneled into a low saddle where scrub ceded to stone, and the night grew ceremonious, as if a small play were about to begin for an audience of rocks. Below, on a flat of ground designed by fate for arguments, I saw our strategist presiding over a tablecloth spread, like a treaty. 2 goblets, a pitcher, the moon mounted like a coin in a merchant's eye. The theatre was tidy. Buttercup sat apart with that regal stillness she used when refusing to collaborate with events. The man in black approached as one approaches a chessboard offered by a friend who intends to lecture you after every move. I hid behind an obliging boulder. Spying is not my habit, but the scene felt ritual, and rituals permit witnesses if they promise to be quiet. Vizzini's voice lifted and sparkled the air with cleverness. He presented choices as traps and traps as jokes, flicked the beads of his logic like an abacus, and demonstrated breathtakingly how a man can talk himself into a corner while believing he has invented a door. I could not, at that distance, measure quantities or name powders, but I recognized the posture of a mind that trusts only itself. It is a lonely bravado. Pride, like certain wines, can be exquisite at first sip and ruinous by the bottom of the glass. What I will tell you is only this. When the game ended, it ended suddenly and without spectacle. A boast became a silence. A certainty collapsed into a chair. A bright mind dimmed as quickly as a wick pinched by prudent fingers. Mercifully, the night absorbed it and did not echo. The man in black stood very still, as if honouring the body's last task of being heavy. Buttercup made the sort of sound you make when a plan has been replaced by a truth. No blade was drawn, no bruise was offered a crown. If there was villainy, it had been invited in by arrogance and served tea with compliments. I considered revealing myself then to tidy what could be tidied, to insist that theatre deserve an audience that claps at the end. But some endings require fewer hands. I withdrew, found Fezzik humming a consoling tune to the stars, and told him only what courtesy allowed. He bowed his large, kind head, and we stood in a silence that resembled prayer not because of holiness, but because of honesty. "He will take her into the fire swamp," I said, after a time, for the landscape ahead spoke plainly. "Then we mustn't follow," Fezzik decided, with a wisdom his detractors mistook for simplicity. "The swamp does not like crowds." The fire swamp announced itself with flickers in the distances, more rehearsals of flame from vents that breathe like beasts, and the restless rustle of undergrowth with opinions. I have no love for that place. It decimalizes courage, removing 1/10 at each step. It taxes attention. It fines the unprepared. We followed the safer perimeter and watched the line of passage through gaps in the scrub. 2 silhouettes moving as if the ground might take offense. At one point the man in black paused and lifted his head in that way brave people do when deciding whether their bravery is truly required. He stepped anyway, teaching his feet to argue with the soil. Buttercup learned the local grammar, the popping warning, the quick step aside. A partnership grew precisely the way partnerships ought to, in shared caution, in sudden competence, in the relief of having someone to hand a fear to, just for a minute, while you address a more immediate bureaucrat of peril. If you wonder how I know, when I was not inside the swamp, I'll confess some knowledges arrive later, folded into other evenings, told by other voices over bread. Fezzik and I would hear parts from villagers and guards with loose tongues, and later still from the man himself, when friendship no longer needed masks. But even then, standing outside the boundary, where the air smelled like hot coins, you could infer the ballothow. A hand offers a hand, not because the story requires romance, but because survival requires choreography. How a joke about not being eaten today can carry a person twice as far as a boast about valor. We lost the silhouettes in a corrugation of smoke. By the time the landscape flattened again and the swamp shrugged them out, the world had reassembled a pursuit. Riders on the far road, banners that mistook urgency for majesty, a prince whose face wore the expression of a man in love with theatrics, but unfamiliar with plays that end well. You can tell a kingdom's priorities by how it allocates horses to ideas. This one had invested heavily in pageantry and lightly in mercy. Fezzik and I withdrew to the plain fact of our position, unemployed, separated from our employer by fate and better judgment, and pointed by the old arrow in my chest toward a corridor in a castle where the carpets muffle more than footsteps. Hunger reminded us that vows do not pay for bread. We walked toward a town that pretended to sleep. On the way, Fezzik tried a rhyme for our circumstances and blushed at his own scansion. Plans go crooked, hearts stay straight. Find your friend before it's late. I told him it scanned perfectly in certain provinces. He smiled, a mountain's worth. If your life has never required you to choose between loyalty to a companion and loyalty to an abstract oath, I envy you the clarity, but I do not quite believe you. We do this at desks all the time. The colleague who needs cover while you file a truth. The neighbor whose fence is a little wrong, but whose kindness is very right. The child whose mistake asks for discipline as well as a sandwich. We scale our ethics to the size of our days and hope the ledger of kindness balances the budget of principles. But we still wonder whether intelligence without humility always contains its own defeat, and whether the cleverest trap we set is often for ourselves a puzzle we solve only to discover we have mistaken a proof for a path. When dawn unfurled itself with bureaucratic efficiency, we had bread. We had a plan that would not pass inspection, but would pass a man and a giant through a gate. And we had a renewed division of tasks. I would go listen for the Count's habits. Fezzik would see what kindness could do at the edges of town. He is astonishing at the edges of anything. Children recognize him as a festival even when there is no music. Dogs judge him a moving shade. Bakers sell him yesterday's loaves at today's price because he makes them believe in the freshness of their work. And I, having learned what the man in black had learned about, mere viewed my failures like a responsible accountant, and found, tucked among the numbers, a dividend. I had not abandoned the better parts of myself in pursuit of the vow. Courtesy had not cost me the quarry. Mercy had not slowed my feet. I had lost a duel and kept a friend. I had watched a mind misused by its owner and chosen not to call that justice. The pursuit of the Count, of meaning, of a version of myself my father might greet without sorrow continued, not faster but truer. The day warmed. The town unbuttoned its shutters. Somewhere beyond our sight a masked rescuer would be captured. A princess would mistake despair for destiny, and a prince would confuse possession with love. Our work, intricate as pastry in a hot kitchen, lay ahead. I tightened my scabbard, felt the small weight of purpose settle at my hip, and set off to study a corridor carpeted against confession. Humility arrives in a simple coat and pays in exact change. After the cliff, I found myself counting my steps. As a penitent counts beads, 4 beats inhale, 4 beats exhale, so the sting of losing could be filed under useful. The man in black had pressed me until my pride yielded, but he had pressed with courtesy. I accepted the lesson in the same currency. A swordsman must be a librarian of his own mistakes. I reshelved mine, a bind taken too eagerly, a feint that over-explained itself, a foot that argued with the ground when it should have agreed. Fezzik, who forgives everyone faster than bread cools, forgave himself for sleep in a single yawn. We shared a crust purchased from a baker who admired my blade and adored Fezzik's appetite. "You will need strength," she said, handing over an extra heel as if it were advice. Strength is complicated. It looks like biceps in drawings. It looks like attention at close range. I promised my attention to the day and went to work the way craftsmen do, by inventory. The town's morning wore its best ordinary. The square rang with buckets. Children practiced the argument between running and being told not to. A clerk chalked prices in numbers so solemn they might have been laws. When a kingdom arranges pageantry, it leaves small errors at street level, too many soldiers at the bakery, too few at the gate. The horse dealer suddenly polite. I watch for those. News rode in whispers. The prince had dispatched riders. The princess had been seen near the fire swamp. A masked man, always masked, never in love, had matched her step for step. People retell danger the way they retell recipes, leaving out what they do not own. Fezzik and I parted our tasks. He drifted toward docks and doorways where sympathy distills into useful fact. Children, as I've noted, treat him as a parade even when he walks alone. Information follows parades. I took the long loop that brushes the castle's outer wall, counting arches and noting where ivy grows too well. A wall tells the truth about the people it protects, where they are lazy, where they are afraid, which window they prefer for watching their own reflection. In the northeast corner, a carpet hung airing, crimson, heavy, with a border pattern so intricate it could hide a map. The breeze shifted. I caught the faint, medicinal breath of herbs. Somewhere inside, a scholar or a sadist kept a tidy cabinet. The distinction is not always obvious from scent alone. My quarry Count Rugen kept punctuality the way some men keep pets. His shadow crossed a certain window at the same morning. Minute 3 days running, a gloved hand adjusted the curtain by the same indifferent inch. Precision can be a kindness in a joiner. In a courtier, it is a shield. I watched, then walked, then watched again. Content to let the day write me small, legible notes. Patience humiliates hurry by outliving it. Do not suppose I forgot the man in black. His sword had written in my memory with a nib that does not fade. If he survived the fire swamp, and I wagered my respect he would, the story would turn inside the castle, not outside it. He would challenge or sneak or improvise 3 verbs in which skill and audacity collaborate. Buttercup would stand very straight and confuse bravery for rudeness at least once more. Princes are excellent at making cruelty pass for ceremony, and somewhere below the elegant carpets the Count would arrange his instruments in the order that made them feel harmless to him. Order often does this, the same way a clean desk makes a cruel letter look professional. At noon I found Fezzik sitting like a boulder hired as a bench, speaking softly to 2 little boys who were trying to rhyme orange. Door hinge, he suggested, and blushed at his boldness. They clapped as if he had invented a holiday. Between his gentle tutorials he had learned much. 2 guards from the west gate had boasted of a hunting lodge fitted with admirations. Their word for mechanisms they neither understood nor distrusted. A cook had delivered covered trays to a stair that went down even though the kitchen was already low. A stable boy had been paid extra to oil the wheels of a cart used at odd hours by a pale man who favoured gloves. It is like a poem, Fezzik concluded. You cannot see the meaning until the last line. I nodded. Then we must read all the lines. Afternoon lowered itself into the town like a cat into a warm chair. We shadowed the flow of errands back toward the castle, and I practiced seeing without looking. The seamstress I mentioned days ago hurried past with a bundle of velvet. When that kind of fabric moves quickly, it leaves behind rumours about who demanded speed. I followed at a parallel, head turned toward a bookstand where a fat volume of sword treatises sat like a sermon in need of a listener. The vendor noticed my pause. Collectors, he sighed, like to own these. Practitioners prefer to practice. I smiled, bought a penny leaflet on knot tying to justify my lingering, and agreed that libraries are rarely sweaty. Light interlude. If you ever feel underachieving, buy a pamphlet on knots. By the third figure 8, you will believe yourself qualified to repair a fleet. As the sun performed its golden diplomacy with the rooftops, a small procession left the side gate no trumpets, only the official anonymity of routine. At its centre, a covered chair moved with the suspension of a secret. I did not need to see the glove to know whose secret it was. The chair turned toward a road lined with stones that remembered royal shoes. Fezzik and I followed at a distance, respectable enough to pass for aimless. The road led to the zoo of death in the book. Here in the tale we knew to a private building in a copse of trees, humble as a lie told well. The guards relieved one another with yawns that matched the ones I had counted at the main gate, punctual even in boredom. We walked past, as if considering mushrooms. If conspiracy were edible, it would be buttered and called harmless. When the procession returned, it carried less noise than before and a smaller chair. I smelled something absent, whatever courage smells like when it has been removed from a room. I did not know then, though later I would know it with the intimacy of regret, that this was the day a machine designed to quantify despair had been demonstrated. The Count kept notebooks. I have never met a cruelty that did not seek to call itself a science. He would have written the numbers carefully, using a calm hand. There are few postures sadder than calm put to wicked use. Evening invited us to the sort of inn where privacy rides on stew steam. Fezzik coaxed stories from men who were certain they had no stories to tell. I listened for the name that mattered Westley and did not hear it yet. The man in black still owned anonymity like a weapon. But Buttercup's name walked the benches with confidence, spoken adoringly by some, resentfully by others, and professionally by those who sensed that a wedding taxes commerce in pleasing ways. I drank water and pretended it was wine, because appearance forms alliances in public rooms. Fezzik composed a couplet to help him remember a guard's schedule. Got lost in the middle and ended with, "And 2 bells after supper. Please don't trip the supper," which no one understood, but everyone found soothing. If this sounds like an episode without heroics, that is because most days are. You cook, you mend, you wait for someone to return from wherever the day sent them. The kettle takes longer when you stare at it. Shoes squeak only when silence would be comforting. The universe enjoys such small humiliations. They are practice for accepting larger truths. I went to our rented room and polished my blade, not because it needed it, but because hands like purpose when hearts have questions. But we still wonder whether the humility that follows a loss is a passage or a destination, whether we accept it only to exit stronger, or whether it is the truer strength we were pretending to chase with victories. Near midnight, the town dreamed municipal dreams orderly, budget-conscious, and the castle's windows went dark by rank. A single light remained in the northeast, the curtain inch the same, the shadow precise. I slept 2 hours, and woke with the feeling one gets when a page is about to turn itself. At the gate, a small commotion. A prisoner caught near the swamp. A report written so neatly it must have omitted something important. Dawn, that bureaucrat with a radiant pen, arrived on schedule. Before the sun finished signing its name on the horizon, a rumour ran faster than it. The prince would marry within days. The princess had agreed. courtyards like news that insists on polishing itself while you hold it. I did not panic. The truth, when cornered by ceremony, often wears better disguises. If the man in black still breathed, he would not consent to an ending chosen by a calendar. If he did not, then my work took on a new adjective: solitary. Fezzik found me where plans like to begin, in the compromise between a map and a guess. He offered a muffin that tasted like determination and said, very softly, "I miss our employer." He meant Vizzini, and also not Vizzini. I placed a hand on his sleeve. "We will employ ourselves," I said, and watch the idea fit him like a good coat. "First we learn the corridors," I continued. "Then we find the staircase that goes down." He nodded as if I had proposed dessert. We moved. Day by day, circuit by circuit, we learned which door squeaked and was forgiven, which guard walked as if his shoes were thinking of other careers, which maid loved the way a hallway grows briefly private when you carry a tray. We learned the rhythm of the kitchens and the prayers of the chapel. I practiced the long patience, the patience that resists theatrics. Humility, it turns out, is not an apology. It is an angle. You approach problems at it, and they show you hinges you could not see head-on. In that angle I stood ready, not bravely, not grandly, but with the steadiness my father's shop had taught me, waiting for the next true moment, the one that would ask for steel spoken plainly. When it came, it would find me disciplined, not dramatic. I owe that to the man in black. I owe it to Domingo. I owe it to myself, who would rather be repaired by loss than ruined by triumph. Some journeys we witness with our own eyes, others we assemble from faithful fragments guards, boasting to impress ale, kitchen folk whispering in the steam, the way a dress remembers ash long after it has been laundered. The fire swamp came to me that way, as a patchwork of precise details. And because details fit together like gear teeth when they are true, I trust what follows. Wesley and Buttercup walked into a geography that makes rules of its mischief. The first rule is flame. The ground breathes it in spurts with a courteous popping beforehand, as if the earth clears its throat before speaking heat. The second is sand that behaves like a trick question, offering firmness until agreement, and then revising the premise, what the locals call lightning sand. The third is rodents, large enough to have opinions and teeth to argue them. What moves me most, retelling what they lived, is not spectacle, but craft. Wesley learned the rhythm of the swamp's breath the way a smith listens for a hammer's sweet spot. He taught Buttercup to pause at the faint pop, to step aside without drama, to treat caution as choreography rather than fear. He tested patches of soil with a branch and an amateur geologist's respect. When the sand did its vanishing act, he reached not with panic, but with a vow made of shoulders and leverage. As for the creatures, let us spare them adjectives and ourselves bravado. There was a struggle. It ended without glory and with enough dignity to sit up afterward. Survival, when practiced cleanly, rarely looks like heroism from the outside. It looks like breath counted to 4 and counted to 4 again until the counting brings you out. Buttercup, who had learned stillness as a defense in court, learned a different stillness there, the kind that lets instruction write itself into muscle. She trusted, Trust is an uncredited collaborator in every courageous act. A woman can carry it like water through a place that drinks people dry. I imagine her dress collecting burrs of soot. I imagine his sleeve scorched in crescents where the pop came late. I imagine the laughter they made to keep the swamp from feeling omniscient, a laughter quiet as knitting. If you have ever calmed a skittish kettle, coaxed a password out of a stubborn device, or guided a child through night terrors by renaming the furniture, you know their grammar. Name the danger, honour it, then proceed. Past the worst, they found the edge where the swamp stops insisting and becomes merely persuasive. There, the road that belongs to public stories rejoined the private one, with banners to certify importance and horses to ensure it. The prince whose face has practised concern the way actors practice bouse arrived with a captain whose smile carries a ledger behind it. Courtiers are experts at making rescue resemble procurement. Reports agree on this. Wesley stood between the mounted men and Buttercup with the courtesy of a host blocking a draught. He negotiated not loudly, not long, because men who mean to keep their word do not decorate it. She, seeing how ceremony sharpens itself on error, offered herself back to the palace if Wesley were allowed to return to his ship unharmed. The prince consented with the sort of grace that looks like a solution and is actually a deferral. Consent is not kindness when the planner is counting on corridors. Count Rugen wore his gloves. I say this not to villainize leather, but to mark the species of neatness that keeps hands innocent and therefore available for anything. He proposed an escort. He proposed efficiency. Wesley considered the odds and weighed them against a future longer than a gallop. Choices like that are rarely framed nobly in the moment. They happen at the speed of breath. He yielded, if we insist on that verb, though in truth he did something braver. He chose the version of danger that kept Buttercup unbroken for the next page. In chivalric romances, this is called devotion. In a smithy, it is called sense. Save the blade, finish the work. I did not see the cart that took him the first turn of the road, but I saw the second, because I had learned to watch where public paths blend into private ones. The vehicle made for the copse, not the gate, for the side door, not the hall. Secrecy, when practiced often, becomes a habit you can spot from across a field. The guards learn to look away in synchrony. The trees learn to keep their leaves. A door learned to listen outward more than inward. When the cart returned, it was lighter by a weight you could measure or a courage you could sense. Both are true. Someone told me later a kind soul who believed science should not be taught to cruelty, that a room below had been prepared with scrupulous attention and a device assembled with the calmness of scholarly footnotes. It measured despair and pretended that made it respectable. Buttercup rode palaceward beside a kindness that had dressed itself as triumph. She had made a bargain. She meant to keep it with the ferocity of those who are tired of being arranged. The prince, who understands bargains the way a spider understands invitations, intended to keep a different one with his image. There was talk of a wedding date. Talk promises certainty in syllables while moving the furniture when you blink. The town started baking. The castle started braiding. The seamstresses threaded days into bodices. When people are busy making garments, they do not look at the stairs that go down. My work narrowed like a hallway. Find the staircase. Find the habit that hides it. find the hour when even vigilance blinks. Fezzik and I divided ourselves the way good bread divides, evenly, with a crumb that holds. He looked for news about the princess's routines. I stalked the draughts that breathed from under a door where no door should back-breathe. If you have ever located a leak by listening to it disobey a wall, you understand my method. By then, the man in black had become a rumour again captured, transformed into the prisoner, a noun that erases names and prepares consciences for compliance. Rumours are furnaces. Feed them carelessly, and they warp what you meant to shape. In a meaner telling, this would be where I confess despair. But despair, as I've met it, is a luxury of those not doing small work. I oiled hinges. I counted the steps from chapel to pantry to guardroom until my feet knew them as well as the sword hilt knows my palm. I bribed the wrong man and learned which alley to avoid, a gain disguised as a loss. I ate bread that made humility a practical virtue. And each night I set my father's memory on the table like a candle and let its steady light rename anger as purpose. A vow must be translated into verbs, or it grows mould. You wish for a lighter interlude? Let me give you 3. First, a laundress offended by a wine stain that resembled a map of a failing empire taught me how to remove it with salt, hot water, and insolence. Second, a boy at the gate tried to sell me a wooden sword and corrected my posture with the confidence of a professor. I paid double. Third, Fezzik memorized the guard rotations by turning them into a children's game and then lost to the children on purpose. They applauded his defeat and improved his data. It is difficult to remain tragic in the company of people who tidy the world's practical corners. But we still wonder whether courage is mostly skill arranged by tenderness, and whether love's finest muscle is not the heart's drum, but the hand that learns new work quickly for another's sake. One evening, as the castle dimmed by rank and the north-east window kept its unrepentant light, the prince announced the wedding for a date close enough to be credible, far enough to be theatrical. Buttercup walked the garden with the measured tread of someone keeping a promise over uneven ground. She looked at the horizon as if it were a messenger late for the appointment. I recognized that gaze from a boyhood in villages where the post arrives on Tuesdays, unless it doesn't. The discipline of hoping without letting it make you sloppy. What would you have me do in such a city of preparations? Break the door. That is noise, and noise pleases the wrong listeners. I preferred a locksmith's philosophy. Study the ward, fashion the key, turn quietly, open. The key, I believed, would be an ally who disliked cruelty more than he liked his salary, or a corridor that disliked itself enough to betray, or a miracle. I am not ashamed to name miracles among my tools. I have seen the world hire them when it has overspent its certainties. And yes, if you have guessed, there was a man and a woman in a small cottage not far from the city, whose trade in remedies extended to the soul with a sarcasm that made hope taste like candy. But that, as yet, was a rumour dressed as a possibility, and I had still to earn my right to knock on that door. For now, let me leave you with a map of resolve. Buttercup, dignified by the cost of her bargain. Wesley, alive somewhere that spelled pain with numbers. The prince, writing pageantry on a calendar and policy on a shadow. The count, cataloguing what should never be counted. Fezzik, collecting kindness as if it were intelligence, and I, Inigo, sharpening attention until it could part silk and without fray, hunting the staircase that goes down, because some rescues begin not with trumpets, but with listening for a door that hates its hinges. Proclamations multiply when truth is scarce. The prince's criers crossed the town like well-paid thunder, announcing a wedding date that walked briskly toward us, and more venom than news that a certain pirate had perished at sea. The word pirate carried the careful contempt of a man who dislikes being reminded that courage can be independent. Buttercup's name rode the sentence like a gilded carriage. Wesley's, if spoken at all, arrived with the finality of past tense. Crowds practiced the posture of celebration while checking their pockets for doubt. Banners went up. Prices, too. I had been counting corridors. The announcements knocked my arithmetic from the shelf. If Wesley were dead, then the clean line of what I admired in the man in black would end in a blot. If he lived, he was captive somewhere that preferred silence to oxygen. Despair, when it tries to rent a room in me, speaks politely and asks only for a corner. I gave it a chair and a glass of something unhelpful. The thieves' quarter makes such accommodations easy. I sat there for an afternoon that behaved like a week. The blade in its scabbard like a book you cannot read while your eyes insist on the same paragraph. Fezzik found me the way rain finds roofs. He filled the doorway, and then the room, and then my attention, without accusation, as if we had merely arranged to meet. He picked up my cup, rescued it from further employment, and set down a parcel that smelled of bread and humility. "No good at thinking," he said, tapping himself. "If I'm alone. Better at lifting. But I can lift a friend out of a chair." He waited for the corner of my mouth to remember its job. When it did, he smiled wide enough for two. We spoke of the announcements. We spoke of the wedding. We spoke of how a story's loudest sentences rarely deserve to be believed first. If your man in black were dead, Fezzik reasoned, counting on his fingers as if numbers preferred to travel in company, he would have died in the swamp or at sea. But there were no bodies, only words. If he lives, he is where words cannot easily visit. He looked down, embarrassed by having made excellent sense. Also, the prince enjoys keeping things for himself. Then he is below, I said. The floorboards suddenly conspirators, where corridors go to forget themselves. My vow, which had been a narrow road, widened to admit this new obligation. Revenge asks for a single address. Rescue makes a map. We needed a sign finer than rumour. The castle provided one with official indecency the next afternoon. A sound, if you can call it, that ran out from under the hill and over the town like cloth being torn into math. It contained more specific grief than a scream and less theatre than a cry. It was the sound a soul makes when a device pretends ethics can be measured. Talk later, given the name, the machine. Fezzik and I were on our feet before our minds had packed. Ultimate, he said, gulping air. Suffering, I finished. Tasting iron. We traced the echo not with ears. The echo hated being followed, but with the way our legs knew where to be useful. The grove kept its best secret in the third tree from the wall, a trunk with a knotted knob that remembered being turned. I have opened more complicated locks. Few felt so personal. We pressed, entered, and let the door sigh back into bark. An albino tended a ledger, and the odd dignity of a man who believes his job is housekeeping when the house disagrees. We interrupted him with firmness, and the promise that if he preferred sleep to alarm, he might have it immediately. He chose sleep. The stairs went down at an angle that made faith a muscle. What do underground rooms take from you? First warmth or pride? The passage that followed had the humility of a hospital without the mercy. In alcoves, levers made suggestions. In niches, instruments pretended they were not verbs. We walked like men who had borrowed a silence and were trying not to crease it. The room at the end was tidy. That is the part that revisits me most. Pain should at least muss the sheets. This pain had been made presentable. Wesley maskless and renamed prisoner by those who need nouns to hide guilt lay arranged with the care some clerks give their pens. His chest did the work of breathing, with the institutional politeness of someone filling out a form. I said his name because names are oxygen's older cousin. He did not answer. Fezzik, whose hands are big enough to count as ideas, reached and then withdrew, and then reached again, as if asking permission. We must carry him, he decided. He is too heavy for anything else. I agreed. We will be his legs, I said, taking the feet. You be his shoulders. Fezzik nodded, solemn. I will also be his rhyme, he added softly, and then, apologizing to the air, tried one. Don't you die, Wesley. Dear friends are near. It was not good poetry. It was very good love. We reversed the path, which is harder than you think. Corridors take offence at being left. Twice we heard footsteps that had practised not meaning anything and hid in cupboards that smelled like clean sorrow. Twice the stairs seemed longer than inbound. Up in the grove, the door remembered us without gratitude. We stepped into a world pretending to be ordinary. Sunlight looked wrong on our faces. Where to? This was the kind of question that eats time if you feed it options. We had, thanks to rumour and necessity, a possibility. A cottage beyond the mill where repairs were done for ailments that embarrassed doctors and emperors' miracles, named with a sarcasm that whetted compassion. I had not yet knocked there, because you should not waste such doors on anything less than need. Miracle Max, Fezzik said, reverent as a baker naming yeast. And his wife, I added, because marriages are usually where miracles keep their coats. We borrowed a cart from a man who owed Fezzik gratitude for once preventing a roof from joining him unexpectedly in bed. Light interlude. The man insisted we also borrow a hat, so the sun will not think you are rude. We wore it. The sun did not comment. We padded Wesley with sacks of wool and a blanket that smelled like industrious lavender. Fezzik walked beside, one hand steadying the bundle, the other shooing flies with apologies. I took the lead with the kind of attention you reserve for carrying soup over uneven stone. If you have ever ferried a feverish child down a hall at 3 a.m., balancing fear with ridiculous competence, counting the steps, noticing the cool spot on the wall where the plaster remembers shade, you know our cadence. Rescue is domestic before it is heroic. We avoided the market, took lanes that prefer geese to gossip, and paused twice to convince a wheel that its purpose was noble. Fezzik licked a thumb and smoothed an offending splinter as if correcting a line in a first draft. But we still wonder whether help delivered late is help enough, and whether the best we can do arriving breathless at the right door with the wrong kind of hope counts as faith or merely as stubbornness, reciting a prayer it halfway believes. The cottage announced itself by smell before sight. Mint, a little vinegar, and the kind of sugar that has had jokes told about it. A sign over the lintel suggested services in the tone of someone who does not wish to be disturbed unless you insist. We intended to insist. I knocked. The door conducted a private argument with its hinges, then opened the width of a diagnosis. "We are close to impossibilities," said a voice that could cut thread without scissors. A woman's eyes measured us in a second and a half, finishing with the bundle. "Ah," she added, "but for stubbornness carrying sincerity under a bad blanket, we reserve exemptions." She let us in the way a surgeon lets daylight into a theatre only as much as necessary. "Max," she called in a tone that proved she loved the man enough to scold him in public. "We have a mostly?" "Mostly what?" came the reply, the syllables expertly annoyed. "Mostly dead," she answered, and out of a back room shuffled a figure at war with retirement. He wore skepticism the way other men wear spectacles, habitually, for improving the focus of his compassion. "I do not do miracles for politics, princes, or men who want revenge when what they need is soup," he said, inventorying Wesley with a frown that moved like an abacus bead. "We offer neither soup nor politics," I said. "As for revenge, I carry it, yes, but not into your hands. I bring you love disguised as a problem. It is possible," I bowed. "Old languages come back to you at the right thresholds." Max harumphed, then leaned a clever ear to Wesley's chest, as if listening for grammar. "Mostly," he conceded, "is better than entirely. Mostly means there's argument left. His wife, Valerie, if the rumours had been kind and correct, arranged bottles like punctuation. Colon here, comma there, a period for later. "Tell me who he is to you," she said, without looking up. "An enemy I admire, and a friend I was late to," I answered. "And to her." She nodded at the air where Buttercup, not present, had nevertheless entered the room. "Everything," I said. The room accepted the word without melodrama. They set about their trade with brisk tenderness, which is how you do difficult work if you expect to endure doing it. Max tested, pressed, complained about the cost of rare herbs, and tried to dismiss us twice in order to watch whether we would leave. We did not. Fezzik held a jar as if it might take offence. I repeated quietly, like a mantra learned in a foregut, the names of the masters. Bonetti, Capoferro, Tibol, Agrippa. Max raised an eyebrow. "Sword people," he grunted, "always believe a good edge solves anything. Today we will try air and a chocolate coating." He reached for a bellows and something wrapped in paper with a pharmacist's piety. "We will come to the remedy in its proper hour. For now, accept that hope changed its posture in that room. It stood less like a beggar, more like an apprentice. We were given small tasks, hold this, warm that. Speak to him as if he were choosing between two doors, and trusted your voice to label them correctly. I told Wesley 3 honest things: that Buttercup's name was being misused by a calendar, that a castle had corridors unsupervised by decency, that we preferred him living. The third, Max advised, is the only one with immediate relevance. He placed a thumb to Wesley's cheek. "Say please to death," he murmured, "and sometimes it defers you for lack of paperwork. If you require a lighter moment to end a heavy day, keep this." Fezzik, instructed to keep the room quiet, shushed his own breathing until he turned pink, then whispered to me, "Is whispering loud if it is very large?" I told him physics had not yet decided. He looked relieved for science. Outside, the kingdom tied ribbons around its intentions and called them destiny. Inside, we untied knots, some of twine, some of fear. The night arranged itself patiently around our stubborn work. Whether the world would reward such labor was not yet negotiable. But the door stood closed behind us, which is half of safety, and the man on the table still argued, which is half of living. Miracles, in my experience, don't wear halos. They insist on paperwork. Max grumbled through his cupboards as if every jar owed him an apology. Valerie moved like a metronome that sang. "Mostly dead," he kept repeating, "is still an argument." He set a bellows against Wesley's ribs with the tenderness of a man urging a door not to stick, then measured powders with the arithmetic of suspicion. The room smelled of mint and kitchen bravery. Fezzik perched on a stool that looked humbly courageous under him and tried not to breathe with such personality. I stood at the foot of the table, sword at my hip, vow at my throat. "Tell me why," Max said without looking up. "Not what why." I spoke carefully. "Because a woman promised herself to the wrong certainty, and the right uncertainty needs a chance to interrupt. Because a prince has confused possession with love and is about to force the confusion into law. Because a man who does not fear pain was introduced to a machine that does not fear numbers. Because friends ought not be late twice." Valerie's mouth softened. Max harumphed, which in his dialect meant the heart had nodded and the brain wanted to catch up. He produced, at last, a thing small enough to hope in, a lump wrapped in paper, glossy with something cheerful. "It tastes like childhood," Valerie said. "That will make the living jealous. He'll need breath and quiet, not speeches. And you," she pointed at Fezzik, "will restrain your rhymes to emergencies." Fezzik nodded, radiant with solemnity. "Only catastrophic couplets," he promised. The chocolate-coated remedy had a ceremony to it. Bellows stroke, timing, a pause that honoured the distance a soul travels when it is called back. We coaxed Wesley to swallow, with the kind of cajoling parents use on stubborn medicines and kings. His throat worked. Nothing happened. Then a little more than nothing. Max listened again, ear bent like a question mark. "A flicker," he declared, "which is to say, a beginning. Do not expect a sprint. Expect a crawl that believes in standing." We waited, because waiting is half of healing. Outside, the kingdom rehearsed festivities. Inside, we rehearsed silence. When Wesley's eyelids offered the faintest opening, the room leaned closer without moving. His voice, when it arrived, sounded like a stranger in its own house. Where, it asked approximately, is the worst of it? "Behind you," I said diplomatically. "Ahead of you," Max corrected professionally, but with friends. This satisfied no one and encouraged everyone. He slept again, and his sleep began to resemble rest rather than surrender. While we waited for more of him to arrive, we planned. Planning in a miracle shop is a test of humility. You draw strategies beside jars labelled with ingredients you cannot pronounce. "There will be a wedding," I said. "Soon. The prince wants ceremony to complete his disguise." Valerie snorted. "Ceremony is just a nice dress for compulsion." Max poked Wesley's palm and watched for a reply. "You'll need an entrance," he said. "Guards prefer exits. Make an entrance they can't categorize." We took inventory, one swordsman set on a corridor he had memorized in dreams. One giant whose strength expressed itself as gentleness until it did not. One hero returning in installments. "What about brains?" I asked delicately. Fezzik looked at me, then at the empty air where Vizzini should have been, and raised his hand. "I have some," he offered. "They are smaller than my hands, but they are mine." I squeezed his shoulder. "You have judgment," I said. "It is a rarer metal." Max rummaged again and returned with a cloak that looked like night taught to behave. "This one resists flame," he said, "because the last man who wore it insisted on walking through candles to prove a point." He handed it to Fezzik, who held it as if it were a bird, unsure about our ethics. "And you will need something with wheels." Valerie's eyes sparkled. "An unassuming cart, perhaps? Or a wheelbarrow that believes in drama?" We nodded. Drama, correctly deployed, is a savings plan for courage. Light interlude. First, Fezzik tried the cloak, which draped like a compliment. He practiced spreading it with menace and only managed magnificence. Valerie coached, less swan, more thundercloud. He tried again and achieved approaching storm that prefers hugs. We applauded. Wesley woke into a room that had edited itself to be kind. His gaze took inventory, found me, found Fezzik, found the sword at my hip as if checking the spelling of ally. He attempted to sit. His body negotiated for a partial credit and won. "Name," he whispered, eyes on me. "Inigo," I said. "Montoya." The syllables moved through him like something remembered by the bone first. "We met on a cliff," he murmured, "and you were very good." "You were better," I answered, cheerful in defeat. His mouth made the ghost of a smile. "Unfortunate," he said. "We require all kinds of competence today. We fed him sips, sense, and only the necessary truth. I told him Buttercup wore a bargain like armor, and a wedding like a sentence with a wrong verb." He closed his eyes as if translating. "We will go," he said, "before calendars become kings." Max pointed a wooden spoon at him. "You will be carried until your stubbornness turns into muscle," he decreed. "Then you may be dramatic." Valerie tucked a blanket in that perfect way only women who have triumphed over many blankets know. "Eat the rest of the miracle," she ordered. "It expires at sunset." Second interlude. Fezzik attempted a pep rhyme for Wesley and produced, to everyone's horror and delight, "Wake up briskly, darling Wesley." Wedding's scheduled move quite testily. Max pretended to faint. Valerie threw a towel at the rhyme. Wesley, to his credit, laughed enough to convince his lungs they had a future. We left the cottage armed with 3 things that matter more than troops. A plan we could actually carry, a cloak that ignored fire, and the permission to trust one another loudly. Fezzik bore Wesley in the cart with the reverence of a man conveying a festival. I scouted ahead with the pragmatic romance of a locksmith. The miracle made good on its promise. By the time the castle shouldered the horizon, Wesley could sit. By the time its banners began their practised smugness, he could speak in sentences longer than a blade. Walking would wait, commands would not. We reconnoitred from a rise where sheep had invented philosophy. The walls were in the mood to say no. Wesley, propped like a general who had divorced comfort, asked for assets. I confessed I had an appointment with a certain corridor and a glove. Fezzik confessed he had a cloak and an unfashionable respect for fire. Wesley did the arithmetic of audacity less showy than Vizzini's, more accurate, and drew a sketch in the dust. Fear first, spectacle second, steel last. Men run from ideas they can name, he said, voice steadying, and from appearances they cannot. We needed a spark for the idea. Evening delivered one. The outer guard had grown complacent with pageantry. The inner guard had been told to expect only relatives of the groom. A cart with a veiled figure could approach as piety. A giant wearing a fireproof cloak could become a legend in the right light. A swordsman who knew thieves' cant and lords' habits could be everywhere and nowhere in a corridor at the same time. "We are 3, I said. "We must look like 30. Wesley nodded. "Then give them a story they will tell each other while fleeing." Third interlude. We practiced lines, not to fool anyone, but to prevent our courage from tripping. Fezzik rehearsed a thunderous announcement and accidentally welcomed everyone to a harvest festival. I tried my scariest glare and looked, by general consent, like a disappointed librarian. Wesley, lying in the cart, found a tone of quiet authority that made even a goat consider its life choices. Practice improved all threesome. Night laid itself along the battlements. Fezzik donned the cloak. He seemed to gather the dark rather than merely wear it. I wheeled the cart, its axle groaning like a complainer who secretly loves the job. Wesley lay within, eyes bright under fatigue. At the gate, we let fear arrive first. Fezzik stepped forward, the cloak suddenly a tide. A torch touched it, and flame refused its invitation. The guards jumped back, dropped a spear, and then their nerve. "He burns and does not burn," one cried, in the voice of a man who has met theology without preparation. They scattered with the sincerity of amateurs. Inside, hallways gathered like choices. Wesley sketched with words. We obeyed with boots. I left them near the point where carpets began to lie, and moved toward the inch of curtain in the northeast window. The world changed scale. The vow, patient all this time, lifted its head like a hound who recognizes a gate. Somewhere ahead, a glove waited to adjust itself by exactly 1 indifferent inch. Soon I would ask my blade to speak a sentence it had practiced since childhood. Not savage, not ornate, simply right. But we still wonder whether a miracle is only the world borrowing our courage for a page or two, and whether the truest enchantment is the agreement, spoken without flourish, to meet danger together and be delivered back to ourselves. We separated then, not as actors fleeing the stage, but as artisans beginning different tasks of the same piece. Fezzik to frighten without harm, Wesley to command without walking, I to find a name and give it its due. In a palace that had measured pain and dressed it with science, we brought disorder in the shape of decency, if that sounds like a small blade against a great machine, remember what my father taught me. The edge is thin, that is why it works. Castles believe in categories. Gates are for arrivals, doors for permission, windows for stories after the fact. If you wish to be believed by a castle, behave accordingly. If you wish to pass through it, decrease your category. We approach the outer wall as an unimportant errand-one cart. One cloaked omen, one swordsman with the posture of a courier who has been told he is late, but not why. Fezzic's new garment, the miracle cloak, hung from his shoulders like weather reconsidering itself. A guard raised a hand for ceremony. Fezzik walked past ceremony and into legend by standing still in the presence of flame. Night gave us its small theatre. A torch brushed the cloak. Fire, brief as gossip and twice as bright, crawled up the fabric and vanished. The guard made the involuntary sound of a man who has just watched his vocabulary resign. Wesley, in the cart, spoke in that steady register that makes people think they are listening to a law of nature. "Announce us to your courage," he advised the men. "It will know what to do." They did exactly what courage, left to itself, does. It delegated. Spear points trembled, a gate forgot to argue, and we rolled into the courtyard with the audacity of ordinary wheels. Inside, the rooms began their usual work of pretending to be permanent. The wedding machinery had been oiled until it believed itself moral. Tapestries disciplined against drafts. Flowers hostage to archways. A carpet like a tame river leading toward vows that had been rewritten by power into purchase. Music practiced obedience. Servants wore the faces you wear when paid to move, as if the day is inevitable. Wesley pointed with words rather than hands, parceling out our courage. Fezzik to the corridor that tends to panic, I to the wing where an extra finger gets comfortable. I left them with reluctance proportional to affection, which is to say, considerable. Fezzik kept the cloak wrapped not around himself so much as around the air, creating a void that men prefer not to enter. Wesley sat high in the cart, breathing as if rationing miles, and sent sentences ahead that opened doors without keys. "Excuse me," he told a pair of guards. "You are required to be needed elsewhere." They were. Authority, spoken softly by someone who means it, is a short road. My road narrowed into that known hallway, the one in my memory, with torches that made the stone look like careful thought. You can smell cruelty prepared for presentation. The air is too well behaved. I moved as my father taught me to move in a forge thoughtfully, as if surrounded by hot things that might take offence. At the corner I paused and listened to the cadence of two men who had been trained to keep secrets by not knowing them. Footfalls. A yawn? A cough that wanted to be a conversation and was not allowed. When they passed, I entered the chapter my vow had been saving its ink for. Elsewhere, the ceremony rehearsed its triumph. I will not name the line is someone else. Hazan besides, the details are as familiar as a dishonest contract. The officiant's voice thinned by distance, the prince's attention divided between spectacle and inventory. Buttercup's stillness, which some call strength, and I, watching from many angles, call a refusal to be moved by anything untrue. There is a ritual phrase about "till death do us part." In certain courts, it means until the narrative can no longer be managed. Buttercup, I am sure, understood the grammar well enough to mispronounce it at the right moment if offered the chance. Back in the honest corridor, I adjusted my scabbard the way a host adjusts a chair before inviting an argument. The door ahead knew it is possible to sense this. Wood remembers intent and opened the width of an edit. Inside, the room wore its cruelty like a uniform hung too neatly to be ashamed. In one corner, a leather-bound ledger waited to forgive anything that had been recorded politely. Beside it, instruments that dreamed of being nouns. And there, the glove. The extra finger, ordinary as a lie told well, resting on a desk where it could pretend to be a habit. Count Rugen, I said, because a name is the proper knock. He turned with the mild annoyance of men interrupted while polishing their control. His eyes performed the quick mathematics sword. Posture, intention, distance to door then settled on me as if cataloguing a misfiled document. He smiled the sort of smile that asks, "Are you sure?" I was. The line I had carried like a medal I refused to show rose in my throat. I did not speak it yet. Words, like blades, deserve the angle they were forged to meet. He reached for a bell. It was small, discreet, the kind of alarm that lets a man keep his dignity while summoning help to do the indignity for him. I let him reach and then stepped with the courtesy of someone helping a guest avoid embarrassment. Steel cleared its scabbard with a sound like a pronouncement shortened for clarity. His hand hesitated. "We may discuss this," he said, "which is politics, for I will outlast your outrage." I shook my head. "I have come to discuss only one truth," I answered. "You know the one. Men who live behind gloves dislike being told their hands are visible." I advanced, not swiftly, but correctly. The room's corners stopped pretending to be square. He lifted a blade that had not known affection, only maintenance. Its edge feared disapproval more than dullness. He was competent. I salute competence even when I intend to puncture it. We touched steel in preliminary questions. His wrist answered with the ease of someone who has trained to be inevitable but not accountable. "Spaniard," he said, and made it sound like an address. "Inigo," I corrected, and let the name do its small work of reminding him that nouns have stories. Before we go further, you should know how the other task proceeded, because our three paths braided at exactly the right moment. Fezzik, draped in storm, found the corridors that fear most enjoys, those that narrow to single file. He unfurled himself there like a moral arriving. Back, he boomed with theatrical compassion, or be forgiven later for running now. Men fled as they always do when asked to choose between dignity and an excellent excuse. He placed his bulk where cruelty might have needed to pass, and thereby taught courage a convenient geography. Wesley, born in his wheeled chariot, reached the antechamber where promises put on perfume. He asked a sensible question, "Where is the prince?" and was given the answer sensible questions deserve when spoken without apology. Inside the hall, a marriage attempted to complete itself with the speed of a signature. Buttercup stood like a sentence, refusing an incorrect clause. The officiant hurried. The prince pressed. Wesley arranged his breath and prepared to make interruption a sacrament. Now, in the room with the glove, the Count tried the angle of conversation one last time. "We have both suffered," he said, as if mathematics would reconcile crime with grief. "Let us be sensible. I admit I almost laughed. Sensible, in his dialect, meant beneficial to furniture. I affirmed my purpose not with a shout, but with a small invocation to the men whose names my father taught me to treat. Like tools Bonetti for beat, Capoferro for line, Thibaut for feet. That think. Agrippa to unlearn what habits try to impose when fear rehearses. This is how I prayed. He discovered a beat too late that a life spent near pain does not teach compassion. It only teaches proximity. When I pressed, he parried out of reflex and arrogance. When he countered, he did it beautifully and falsely, the way a practiced liar tells the truth with the wrong emphasis. We moved through the room as if testing whether the corners would confess. They did not. The blades conversed. Mine began to remember its sentence, the one that ends properly, without adjectives. If you are waiting for my famous words, hold your breath. Another paragraph. We must let the moment arrive, with its antechamber. He lunged with a geometry that would have pleased the teacher who drew it and disgraced the student who used it. I took the line off-center, invited his weight to overcommit, and returned the invitation with interest. He staggered a step not visible to amateurs. His eyes measured the distance to the bell again and found it smaller and unfriendlier. The room sensed at last that it was an accomplice and resented the evidence. Elsewhere, Wesley interrupted history. I am told he was pale as paper and precise as print. The ceremony stumbled over the word marriage, which refused to take its proper shape without consent spelled correctly. Buttercup's face learned a new verb, relief. The prince learned a new noun, obstacle. Guards performed a ballet that failed to agree on choreography. Fezzik collected the nearest braveries and sent them running for the back exits, blessing them as they went. You see how a plan grows into a mercy when everyone does the small part he can do. Back to the Count. He tried speed. Speed is the resume of cowards and geniuses. It hides as many sins as it forgives. I slowed the exchange by insisting on grammar beat, step, measure, breath, until the fight became a conversation he did not wish to finish. The glove looked less like a habit and more like a confession. At last, I gave the room its sentence. "Hello," I said softly, "because I am my father's son, and because beginnings deserve gentleness even at ends. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to you know the rest, but let me say that in that instant the words were not theatre. They were arithmetic, concluding sum, therefore." He paled as if someone had opened a window onto his past. He guessed, correctly, that I would not be dissuaded by apology minted too late. He guessed, incorrectly, that I could be distracted by insult. We fought in earnest, and in that earnestness I found not rage, but accuracy. Rage scatters, accuracy attends. My blade, trained on a lifetime of mornings, did what it had been promised. It told the truth. His faltered not because it was poorly made, but because it had been poorly purposed. You cannot ask a tool to defend a lie forever. Eventually it chooses the hand that honors it. I will save the final gesture for its own room soon, very soon, because even justice should be allowed a breath before it lands. For now, accept that the Count began to understand the shape of his last page, and I began to understand the cost and the relief of paying a debt with something other than interest. But we still wonder whether vengeance, even when clean, can return what it avenges, and whether justice, to be more than an echo, must be braided with mercy in some proportion we may never quite measure. In the corridor, the wedding unravelled into laughter where it could, and strategy where it had to. Wesley's voice learned to stand without legs. Fezzik's hands learned to be doors that opened the right way. I stood, sword forward, breath even, my father's name like a steady hand on my shoulder, and prepared to give the truth its plainest punctuation. A room can learn what it has been helping. When the Count realized I would not be negotiated into a footnote, the air changed sides. He lunged with the speed of a man accustomed to winning by schedule. I met him with the patience of a workshop hymn beat. Step, measure, breath, until his momentum turned into my angle. Our blades conversed in the tight grammar of experience. He tried to borrow authority from velocity. I borrowed it from balance. His smile thinned to the length of a blade. Mine became purposeful and small. He marked me once a line at the shoulder, sharp enough to become a memory, not a spectacle. Pain entered politely and stayed out of the way of attention. I answered not by enlarging wrath, but by narrowing purpose. "Hello," I told him again, because some truths prefer repetition. "My name is Inigo Montoya." He flinched at the name the way a locked door shivers at the right key. "You killed my father. Words can be a whetstone when used rightly. Prepare to... The sentence completed itself in his eyes before I needed to lend it breath. He retreated a step to borrow courage from the bell. I refused him the loan. A bind, a change of line, the steadiness my father taught me to keep when the edge is close enough to count freckles. These were the coins I spent. He parried well, but well is a town far from right, and my road had always pointed toward right. His blade slipped from the argument and lay down on the carpet as if it had remembered its conscience. The room, suddenly without its old grammar, waited to see who would supply a new one. "I would bargain," he said almost calmly, as if bargaining were a charitable act. "There are offers that arrive with polite ribbons to disguise that they were tied by fear." "I do not bargain with the past," I answered, "only with the future." The hand that had raised a bell now trembled a little, without asking permission. I stepped close enough to measure the distance between harm and justice, and chose the latter. What happens in some tellings I will not repeat. Gore is a poor pedagogue. I will say only that I ended the duel the way a craftsman finishes a sentence, without flourish, with truth, and with the restraint that keeps victory from becoming a new kind of wrong. I stood a moment, breathing the way a forge breathes after work. Slowly, gratefully, my father's name in me became less of a shout and more of a benediction. The ledger on the desk lay open. I closed it, because some books do not deserve air. Then I picked up my sword, the one I had carried as a student, and now held as a steward, and bowed to the empty room, not for the Count, but for the blade that had listened well. Light interlude. As I turned to go, a quill rolled off the desk. I caught it by the feather, and felt suddenly absurdly domestic, as if I ought to tidy the curtains too. The thought made me laugh quietly, like a secret between me and a window. Elsewhere, an interruption grew wings. Wesley, still propped against his fragility like a calm against a storm, met the prince in a room that thought it had memorized victory. I arrived too late to see the first exchange, but I know its shape. A chair, a sword that remained oddly sheathed, a tone that behaved like gravity and persuaded the furniture to take sides. The prince, skilled in the theatre of force, attempted to stage a triumph. Wesley staged a definition. He promised a consequence to the pain, not to the death which is tidy and flattering, but to the awkward, durable reality of living with what one has chosen to be. Even told in paraphrase, the idea made the room repent its acoustics. Buttercup stood straight enough to make every false vow nervous. She had learned the most difficult choreography, how to move exactly as much as truth asks, and no more. At a critical syllable, the officiant's language failed to bind the day. Consent is the only lock that holds. The prince, discovering that authority can be out-argued by integrity spoken softly, gave a performance of outrage that fooled no one's conscience. Wesley, keeping breath like an accountant, completed the illusion that courage was an unlimited resource. It was not, but illusions, if aimed ethically, buy time for something truer to arrive. Fezzik, meanwhile, had become a logistics department disguised as a thundercloud. He found 4 white horses, the good kind that think before they stop. He later reported proudly and stationed them where desperate exits turn into plans. A boy asked if giants get saddle sore. Only in their feelings, Fezzik confessed gravely. The boy awarded him a pastry for honesty. I met our friends at the point where corridors converge like mistruths cornered by facts. Buttercup was the first to see me. Her face, usually disciplined into calm, lifted a degree I will not over-describe. Wesley's eyes took me in as one takes in a tool returned from the smith-tested. "True. Inigo," he said, and gratitude warmed the syllables. "The Count? A chapter closed?" I answered. "We do not always need footnotes when the text has been corrected." We moved, each toward our task. Wesley's body declined to sprint, so his voice did the running, sending concise orders ahead like couriers with perfect shoes. Buttercup matched her pace to his without making a ceremony of it, love's finest courtesy. I drifted along the edges where trouble sprouted, pruning it with presence rather than spectacle. The palace, which had prepared to celebrate a possession, found itself surprised into respecting a partnership. On the stair near the East Tower, a knot of guards rediscovered their training in reverse. Fezzik arrived and suggested with irresistible kindness that they pursue their duties in the courtyard immediately, then accidentally added a rhyme. "Down you go, steady and slow," which the men obeyed with comic relief. One tripped, looked scandalized at the idea of falling in front of a giant, and righted himself with such determination that I almost applauded. We reached the outer court as bells argued about whether to announce triumph or adjustment. Night smelled of horses and reprieve. The 4 mounts waited like sentences ready for the right subject. Wesley, whose legs had not yet signed their consent forms, was lifted into a saddle with a choreography we executed once and never forgot. Fezzik's steadiness, Buttercup's accuracy, my habit of making sharp edges behave. She mounted with that ease only necessity teaches. I swung up slightly clumsier than pride prefers and forgave myself on the spot. but we still wonder whether the wrong done to the past can ever be compensated by correctness in the present, and whether mercy rendered late but clean counts as a true balance, or only as interest paid on a debt we cannot close. We took the long way out, because victory should not be paraded through rooms that did not earn it. Fezzik hummed a tune that has no proper name except safety at last, and horses, being excellent critics, approved by not spooking at shadows. From a high window we heard the prince's voice attempting to reconcile how a day can vanish without permission. Perhaps he learned a lesson about ownership. Perhaps he learned only caution. Lessons arrive. Whether they unpack is another story. The city fell behind us with the satisfaction of a closed book. Fields received us, practical and unsentimental. Wesley rested against Buttercup's certainty. The miracle had been spent wisely and completely. He looked at me over the heads of our horses. "Your father?" he asked, because good men ask the question that matters even when they are tired. "Answered," I said. The word felt neither triumphant nor hollow. It felt level, like a table, set for bread. Grief at last could sit without demanding the head of the table. Light interlude, as if ordained by some generous kitchen god, the sky offered a silliness own star brighter than its manners, pretending to be a lantern hung by a tidy cosmos. Fezzik waved, solemn. "For the record," he told the star, "we return your horses when they are unneeded." The star made no objection. Wesley smiled without moving much. Buttercup exhaled a long-held page. We camped not far from the road that re-enters the world of errands. Fires were unnecessary. Warmth comes from proximity when courage has just finished its shift. I cleaned my sword with the deliberation of someone doing more than cleaning. Wesley slept as if rest itself had finally voted for him. Buttercup kept watch for a time and learned, I think, the pleasant boredom of safety. Fezzik, who snores like a gentle bellows, provided rhythm. I thought of my father's bench, of a ledger closed, of a room that had stopped pretending to be neutral. Then I slept too, not like a victor, but like a man who has placed a tool back on its hook. If you wish a final small grace, take this. Near dawn, a farm dog appeared, considered us, and after a thorough internal debate, decided we were the kind of strangers who could be ignored comfortably. That is a benediction most kings never receive. Morning would ask its practical questions: food, direction, the nursing of wounds that are mostly tiredness, the larger questions: what revenge has left me fit to do? What story I should steward when I am no longer sharpening my father's name on the future would come later, and I would try to answer them without drama. For now we had air that belonged to no prince, a road that belonged to anyone polite enough to use it, and the unglamorous happiness of having left a palace slightly more truthful than we found it. Dawn negotiated with our small camp the way a careful host negotiates with shy guests curtains first, then tea. We rose into a morning that belonged to no banner. The 4 white horses approved our survival by chewing calmly. Horses are better philosophers than most nobles. Wesley tried standing. His body voted not quite, and he accepted the result like a seasoned parliamentarian. Buttercup steadied him with the kind of touch that has nothing to prove. Fezzik shook crumbs from the miracle cloak and folded it as respectfully as one folds a flag that has been useful without demanding worship. We took the road that aims toward ordinary. It is a relief and a challenge, ordinary. Miracles prefer curtains, errands prefer lists. I felt my shoulder complain where Rugen's blade had left its brisk signature, and I adjusted my scabbard the way a man rearranges books to make space for a new one. Revenge, completed without spectacle, asks the heart what it intends to do with its afternoon. For the first mile, my answer was simple: carry friends out of reach of a calendar that had tried to pretend it was destiny. Buttercup rode nearest Wesley, keeping the pace of a promise rather than a chase. Once she laughed low, as if the world might be startled to find it still had permission. Wesley let the laugh arrive and set like weather. "I prefer the kind of safety that includes inconvenience," he said dryly. And that remark, with its tidy architecture, reassured me more than any speech could have. He was not all the way back, but his wit had unpacked a chair. Fezzik, who disapproves of silence if it seems lonely, told us a story about a baker who once accused him of stealing the smell of bread. "I offered to return every whiff," he said gravely. "He forgave me and gave me the heels." We awarded him the morning's medal for diplomacy. Light interlude. First, a goat ambled into our path, reconsidered its career after seeing a giant, and embarked on a life of better decisions. Fezzik bowed to the goat. "Congratulations," he said. "May your choices continue." We paused at a stream that believed in clear outcomes. Fezzik filled skins. Buttercup found a patch of shade that had been waiting for her. Wesley dozed in the saddle with the dignity of a man outsourcing verticality. I crouched to wash the sword's throat, careful not to make the ritual pious. Steel prefers honesty to ceremony. In the ripples I saw my father's shop bench bellows, the habit of finishing what your hands begin. "Domingo," I said inwardly, and the name answered by not hurting. Memory sent me a dossier of the night's essential kindnesses. A machine denied its final arithmetic. A marriage that refused to conjugate without consent. A prince forced to learn that possession is not the grammar of love. A corridor that stopped pretending to be neutral. I had taken the sentence I'd promised to say once and say right my name is Inigo Montoya, and spoken it with accuracy instead of rage. Rage, I had learned, is a poor stenographer. Accuracy writes legibly for tomorrow. We moved on. The road lifted to a ridge from which the sea wrote its signature in patient lines. Wesley, eyes on the horizon, spoke as if reading a letter that had finally arrived. "That cliff," he said, "was a good beginning." He meant the duel. "And this," Buttercup added, "is a better middle." The word middle pleased me. Stories that end too soon confuse justice with punctuation. Fezzik, eager to contribute, offered, "Middles need snacks." We agreed on bread. The day warmed. My wound tugged like a child wishing to be carried. Precision is a habit. I deployed it on my own body, shorter stride, deeper breath. No dramatics. Pride, if allowed, will stage an unnecessary tragedy out of a paper cut. "I am fine," I said, meaning it with an asterisk. Buttercup glanced once and produced a strip of cloth from nowhere, as women do in emergencies, and men forget to remember. "For your library of mistakes," she said, tying a band that kept the ache in footnotes. I bowed on horseback, an undignified manoeuvre. Light interlude, second, a lark, hearing our shuffling, attempted to teach us a tune. We failed gracefully. Toward noon, the road divided. One arm toward a market town, the other toward a smaller village with a name unproud of itself. Town means questions, Wesley observed. Village means stew. Fezzik voted stew. Buttercup voted whatever kept horses content. I voted for a place where a man with a recent history of principled interruptions might not be recognized by every ambitious cousin of the guard. We turned villageward and let anonymity do its civil work. We arrived at an inn with a sign that had lost the argument with weather long ago. The innkeeper practiced a hospitality of efficient suspicion. Eyes quick, hands quicker. "Rooms?" he asked. "One," Wesley answered, "for four, and a stall for those who carried us farther than we admit." The man softened by a degree. People who respect animals get a discount in any moral economy. We ate the sort of meal that reminds a body how to be cheerful. Bread that tolerated honest butter. A stew that did not pretend to be anything. Fezzik's bowl required refilling as a matter of physics. Buttercup, having spent days wearing conversation like armor, let the food do the talking. Wesley took small, sensible bites and paid attention to his breath, which had been an unreliable employee and was now applying for permanent status. Only once did the room remember we were not anonymous. A traveller, pale with the courage of gossip, mentioned a wedding in the city, and glanced at us as if we might be the kind of strangers who improved a story. Wesley's expression offered neutrality as a philosophy. I smiled in the language of, "We are not the chapter you are looking for." The traveller accepted the edit and went on to slander a cheese. After, in the privacy of a room that had taught humility to linens, we performed practicalities. I sewed the tear in Fezzik's sleeve with the competence of a man who has darned his vow many times. Buttercup braided her hair into a proposition the wind could not refuse. Wesley slept 2 hours without apology. I sat by the window where trees confess to birds, and considered the shape of a life without revenge at its centre. A man can be organized by a single sentence for so long he forgets how to shelve anything else. I tried out new labels: teacher, companion, steward of craft, a friend who arrives on time. But we still wonder whether identity built on an ending can learn the grammar of beginnings, and whether justice, once spoken, can become quieter without becoming smaller. Toward evening, Wesley woke with a face that had negotiated with fatigue and won terms. "I have a suggestion," he said. Buttercup arched an eyebrow, a gesture that contained equal parts curiosity and mercy. "We disappear for a while," he went on. "I owe anonymity my second best thanks." "Your first?" I asked. He looked at Buttercup. The question did not require minutes. We agreed on west because the sea belongs to fewer liars than land. Fezzik produced, from somewhere in his memory, a fisherman who owed him a favour for once preventing a barge from forgetting. It was not a bird. "He will take us," Fezzik promised, "if we sit where the nets do not wish to sit." Arrangements like this are how good days chain themselves together. Light interlude. Third, on the way to the shore, a child challenged Fezzik to an arm-wrestling bout with a stick. He accepted, the stick triumphed, and the child awarded him a pebble for bravery. He kept it. Courage likes souvenirs. We reached a cove where boats practiced being modest. The fisherman, wrinkled as a well-read, map studied us as if we might be weather. "You smell of palaces," he said to Wesley. "We prefer to smell of salt," Wesley replied. That answer purchased more trust than coin. We hired an hour of horizon. As the boat took our weight, the world resumed its better scale. Gulls, rope, the sound of oars reasoning with water. I thought of the cliffs and the first duel, and felt gratitude arrive such that it did not need to speak. Beyond the headland, the sea wrote us into a smaller story with larger meanings. Buttercup leaned back against the boat's ribs, and her crown the invisible kind, which is the only moral variety rested. Wesley's hand found hers as a matter of course, rather than ceremony. Fezzik fed a loaf's heel to a gull that had petitioned politely. I closed my eyes and counted breaths, not for discipline this time, but for inventory. 4 in, 4 out, like my father's bellows. The day, fit. When we returned to shore, the fisherman offered us the kind of advice that replaces prophecy when people age well. If you must run, run toward. We took it. The road inland waited like a paragraph ready for verbs. Wesley, still rationing strength, conceded to the saddle. Buttercup kept time at his side. Fezzik carried the cloak and all the kindnesses the day had paid him. I walked a little ahead, listening for the sound a new life makes when it clears its throat. Night approached without politics. We chose a small orchard for our camp, a place where trees have learned to share. I cooked something that flattered the onions. Fezzik recited a rhyme so gentle the stars pretended not to hear. Wesley retold In the Economy of the Recently Reprieved the part where he had promised the prince a life to the pain. "It works," he explained, "because imagination is a more reliable instrument than fear." Buttercup smiled into the dark. "And because you were right," she said, "about the grammar. I sharpened the sword not because I expected another corridor, but because it is good form to keep tools honest. Perhaps I would teach not dueling, which encourages men to confuse theatre with virtue, but balance. Attention, the art of listening with the wrists. Perhaps Fezzik would invent a children's sport that rewards kindness as points. Perhaps Wesley and Buttercup would find a corner of the world where courage could retire without becoming bored. Perhaps my father's bench, if I ever find it again, in some workshop the world forgot to demolish, would accept my hands as they are now. Steady, scarred politely, available. When sleep came, it did not negotiate. In the quiet, just before it won, I heard a sound from the rhoda rider, or a rumour. We would learn, in the next part, whether the kingdom had given up quickly or merely paused to breathe. I placed my sword within reach, but not out of fear, out of habit. Habits, properly chosen, are the scaffolding of peace. Night folded around the orchard as if tucking in a lesson. I woke to the sort of quiet that has recently negotiated with noise. Somewhere far off, a cart remembered a rattle and forgot it again. Wesley's breathing had settled into an agreement. Buttercup slept the way trust sleeps with one hand open. Fezzik's snore rose and fell like a friendly tide. I lay listening until the dark admitted a small confession. Hoofbeats, deliberate not urgent professional men riding like punctuation. We were not surprised. Castles, when contradicted, send footnotes. I tapped Wesley's shoulder. He woke the way well-trained injuries wake politely, ready to negotiate limits. Buttercup sat up at once, one braid falling across her shoulder like a line through a map. Fezzik was already standing, as if he had not slept at all, but had merely given the night someone to lean against. "Guests?" he whispered hopefully. "Let them be the kind who like muffins." I shook my head. "The kind who prefer forms in triplicate." We did not plan grandly. Grand plans are for rooms. Travel demands brevity. Wesley outlined a small choreography. I would greet them at the road's lip with the posture of a man who has nothing to hide and everything to say. Fezzik would emerge through the trees with the calm of weather. Buttercup would not be argued with, an art she had perfected. "If they are polite, we will be grateful," Wesley said. "If they are not, we will be better." He smiled the smile of a man whose strength is still a promissory note and knows it. 4 riders, livery honest and faces earnest. The leader bearded, the kind of eyes that have learned not to exaggerate, raised a hand. "Under order of the prince," he began, and even the trees looked mildly bored. "I am under order of the sea," Wesley answered from the saddle, voice steady. "It recommends distance." The man assessed our little assembly and discovered a fact he did not resent. None of us had the appetite for a skirmish whose story would not be worth telling. He dismounted, held his reins as if apologizing to the horse for bureaucracy, and said, "I am to ask whether you intend to return." "To what?" Buttercup asked with the simplest cruelty. He considered honesty and chose it. "To the life that is arranged for you." "No," she said, but softly. He nodded, relieved to be dismissed from the pretense of persuasion. Another rider young, new to uniforms, shifted as if to declare a principle. The leader ventured him a look that said, "Not today." "Tell your prince," Wesley said, "that we prefer a different grammar. We will not belong to his nouns." The leader bowed as if language deserved respect, even when inconvenient. "I will tell him a more useful thing," he replied, "that you were not here when I arrived." He swung up with the grace of a man who plans to keep most of his bones uninjured until retirement. They turned and rode back the way conscience likes to travel, steady without flourish, light interlude. As they left, one horse produced a sound so rude the knight pretended not to hear it. Fezzik, solemn, saluted the horse for comic timing. We moved at daybreak. The road inland kept its patience. Fields pretended not to eavesdrop on history. We passed hedges shaped by hands that prefer pruning to politics. The world, when not commanded by princes, is a composition of small decencies. My shoulder complained, and then made peace. I shifted weight. The ache accepted negotiation. "You are better at conversations," I said to my own body, "when you believe in outcomes." It agreed by allowing me to reach for the waterskin without singing. Buttercup glanced. A strip of linen appeared like an argument prepared in advance. "We are not returning to that city," she said, tying a fresh band. "But I am returning to myself." I bowed. Less clumsy this time. We chose to swing by the cottage of the sarcastic saints. Gratitude has legs. It should be walked. Miracle Max greeted us with a grunt that meant, in his dialect, I have been expecting proof that I was right. Valerie kissed Buttercup's cheek as if blessing a thesis. "You look lived," she said approvingly. Wesley submitted to a perfunctory inspection. "Breath?" Max demanded. "Present," Wesley replied. "Good," Max said. "Arrogance, reduced to sustainable levels." "Better," Valerie judged. Fezzik offered them a basket of pears he had carried for 2 miles, like a penance. "For your pantry," he said, "and for our thanks." Valerie accepted both. Max accepted only after insulting the pears for being too confident. We lingered an hour. Wesley dozed. Buttercup asked Valerie about salves and about marriage, where the verbs are consent and patience. I asked Max whether he believed in retirement. "I believe in research," he said. "Retirement is just asking different questions with more comfortable chairs." "Then I may visit," I said. He shrugged without discouragement. Fezzik sat with neighborhood children, building a fortress from sticks and reminding them gently that the point of a fortress is to know when to open gates. Beyond the cottage lay a fork. The left road would bend toward coasts and the kind of anonymity that sands away names until they shine. The right road turned inland, where trades keep their windows open and apprenticeships travel on bread. We chose left for a week of safety and right for a life. The sea can teach you to be small without being diminished. Towns can teach you to be useful without being used. We wanted both lessons. We hired a cart because practical choices are a love language. Wesley stood a little more each day, then walked a little, then sat again, without apology, the rhythm of an honest recovery. Buttercup practiced the art of letting silence be intimate rather than awkward. Fezzik collected friends in the shape of bakers and dogs. I began listening for a shop that called my hands by their first names. On our second coastal evening we found such a shop. Its door bowed by salt, its window confused about whether to reflect the sea or admit it. Inside, an anvil shyly speaking, a bench with scars it did not regret, a bellows that remembered its own hymns, the smithen old woman whose eyes could level a shelf by looking at it. It watched me touch the tools, as if introducing future colleagues. "You know the grammar?" she said. "I knew a teacher," I answered. She nodded in the direction of absence. That is how grammar travels. I asked for a week's use of her corner. She asked for repairs on 3 blades and the truth about my posture. We agreed. Light interlude. She corrected Fezzik's hammer grip and turned him within 10 minutes into the sort of assistant every shop pretends it discovered. I worked. The work worked on me. The first blade required only attention. The second required an apology and new temper. The third required acceptance that some metal decides to be honest only after you admit you misheard it. I signed none of them. I left them correct. Buttercup watched sometimes, learning the difference between shine and finish. Wesley listened from a stool and told the kind of stories steel prefers. Precise, not heroic. Fezzik stacked wood as if making a certificate of competence 3 logs thick. At week's end, the old smith poured tea like an award. "You will not be able to stay," she said, without making it sound like a banishment. "Stories with your kind of verbs are migratory." "I intend," I said, "to travel slower." "Good," she replied. "Slower is not later. It is truer." I liked her enough not to make a rhyme. Fezzik made one on my behalf, forge and friend. Begin and mend and blushed so thoroughly The tea refused to steam in his presence. We turned inland then, toward villages where a man with steady hands can buy bread with usefulness. Wesley's strength matured into reliability. He walked as if the ground had signed a contract. Buttercup practiced names for tomorrow, not princess, not property. Perhaps gardener of calm. She wore them well. Fezzik adopted a dog of ambiguous ancestry who resolved arguments by sitting on the disagreeable. We were beginning to look less like fugitives and more like citizens. A mile out from a market town, a boy challenged me with a stick and a grin. "Teach me the trick," he said. "That wins." I shook my head. "I will teach you the practice that loses slower every day." He considered, tasted the wisdom, accepted it as candy you have to chew. I showed him the stance that helps your heart echo in your heels. He learned quickly because he was willing to look foolish perfectly for 10 minutes. That is the door most adults paint shut and call experience. At the inn that night, the room performed the modest miracles of hospitality. A bed that consented to the idea of rest, a window that admitted only the right amount of rumour, soup that put the day to bed gently. A fiddler lobbied for cheer. Someone sang a song that had outlived its politics. We did not speak of princes or devices or corridors. We said little and meant it. Wesley and Buttercup sat with their shoulders making promises. Their mouths did not need to underwrite. Fezzik beat me at a quiet game of stones by pretending to be bad until it was useful to be good. I let him revel. He needed to practice winning at things that harm no one. But we still wonder whether peace is a place or a pace, and whether a vow once fulfilled becomes a museum piece or a tool you keep near in case a friend needs the same sentence said for them. Near midnight, a messenger found us, though not the prince's kind. Valerie's handwriting marched across the page like efficient hope. Max had accidentally burned a government file. Miracles were out of stock until spring. If we were to send a thank you, send it as laughter. Also, the postscript added, "A certain corridor has been taken out of service. It dislikes its legacy." I folded the note with care and fed it to the fire. Gratitude burns clean. We slept, and morning arrived with the shamelessness of a new beginning. As we saddled, the old question rose in Menot, the hungry, lunging one about vengeance, but the quiet, domestic version, how to be useful without becoming sanctimonious, how to keep craft honest, how to remain available to love when it asks for furniture moved or a kettle watched. My father's bench lived in my hands. His name rested in me without shouting. The road unrolled as if amused by us. The world, having survived our rescue of it in one small corner, invited us to try something harder. Not rescuing, but living. We agreed. The map shrank to errands and grew to meanings. We moved inland by days that tasted of apples and repair, outward by evenings that practiced unimportance well. In a market town with onions stacked like arguments, I traded an afternoon's tempering for a sack of nails, a loaf, and the loan of a story about a prince who had lately discovered limits. Wesley tested his recovered balance by standing with his eyes closed and persuading the floor to be his friend again. Buttercup learned the names of trees not for their beauty, but for the shade they offered at particular hours. Fezzik, whose kindness is a weather pattern, taught children a game in which points are awarded for noticing when someone looks left out. The kingdom exhaled in rumours. A laboratory repurposed as a library. A captain promoted for honesty rather than noise. A wedding quietly postponed for lack of consent. There will be more pageants, Wesley predicted, but fewer traps labelled love. He said this with the humility of a man who knows that reform is a patient verb. One morning we turned off the road toward a village where an old friend of craft had a space to rent for hands that prefer to make rather than to accumulate. The shop was ordinary in all the ways that hold. I cleaned the bench with the gratitude of a tenant who intends to be a steward. The first customer brought a blade that had been faithful to a farmer's chores. The second brought a pruning hook that had forgotten its own curve. I made things right without sermon. When you do small work properly, the room learns to breathe with you. At week's end we walked to a low hill that overlooked fields with the serenity of practised generosity. I carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, filings from the first honest steel I had shaped since the corridor, a chip of the anvil that had accepted my apology, a letter I had written to my father that said only, "I finished the sentence." I placed the bundle in the earth with no ceremony grander than steady hands. The wind attended politely. Wesley and Buttercup stood a little apart, letting privacy be nourished by presence. Fezzik pressed the soil with that gentleness he gives to doors and dogs. The hill took the secret and made it edible for grass. On our way back, a boy ran up with the astonishment that only very new people can get away with. "Are you the ones who made the prince go quiet?" he demanded. "No," Buttercup said, smiling. "We are the ones who made ourselves listen." The boy considered this and decided it was better, if harder to brag about. Days continued their honest arithmetic. Wesley and Buttercup spoke less in vows and more in chores: who would fetch water, who would mend the strap, who would carry the silence for a while and return it tidy. Once, at a fair, a man in a bright jacket announced a contest of swordplay for applause. I did not enter. I taught 3 children to hold a wooden blade without lying to their posture, then bought lemonade from a girl who refused to oversweeten. The applause from the contest sounded like coins. The thanks from the children sounded like future. There were letters. Valerie wrote to say she had taught Max to nap without calling it research, and that the corridor beneath the castle was now a storeroom for blankets. Blankets, the postscript said, are instruments of rescue that do not brag. I read that line twice and folded it into my pocket like a talisman. Another letter announced that Fezzik's dog had been elected official greeter of a coastal town by acclamation. No one else had stood for the office, because who competes with a creature that recognizes everyone as returning from somewhere worthy? We visited the sea again. The cliffs looked busy with their old arguments: height versus humility, stone versus salt. At the ledge, where 2 men once bowed into a conversation of steel, we set bread and cheese as an offering to absurdity overcome by grace. Wesley's hand found the rope we had climbed and not climbed. He smiled at it as one smiles at a teacher who was right in a way that hurt then and heals now. Buttercup, hair braided against the breeze, allowed herself a moment's unhidden joy, the kind that is not loud because it is safe. Fezzik asked the horizon for a rhyme and received, from somewhere beyond our titles, stand and mend, step and tend. he blushed at its simplicity. We approved its accuracy. In the evenings, when the day's edges had been sanded by usefulness, I wrote a little nothing elaborate, only the ledger of a life repaired by small verbs. Filed, lifted, taught, carried, apologized, laughed. When I taught, I borrowed my father's method. Fewer nouns, more angles, fewer speeches, more balance. I told students that a parry is a kind of listening and a riposte a reply, that accuracy is kinder than flourish, that rage is a poor stenographer. Some wanted shortcuts. I taught them patience instead. It is the only shortcut that wears well. But we still wonder whether peace is a craft or a climate, whether the justice we spoke in one bright corridor can keep speaking in kitchens and lanes, whether love, once it stops being a rescue and becomes a room, can remain miraculous without demanding curtains. And we wonder, too, whether the self built around a vow can become porous enough to let in friendships that are not instruments but ends, whether grief, once answered, can become a tutor rather than a tyrant. The last 500 words of a story like this should not gallop. Let them be a walk home as dusk negotiates with lamps. I have learned to prefer the weight of a door set right on its hinges to the rush of an entrance forced. I have learned to hand a sharp tool to another person with the blade turned inward to myself. I have learned late adequately that a promise kept gently is stronger than a promise kept loudly. When towns ask for help, I try to answer with the competence of a well-folded map. When no one asks, I practice until the wrist remembers kindness faster than display. Sometimes I dream the corridor again, as rooms will revisit you when you stop giving them rent. The torches have less authority. The ledger remains closed. The bell does not remember its task. I enter, do nothing, and leave. This is not bravado. It is repair. The old fury has thinned to a thread I keep as a bookmark, not a leash. When I wake, I polish the blade only until it reflects a face I am willing to answer to. I see my father more often now that I am not chasing him. He appears in the corner of the shop when the light is honest hands folded, approving economy of motion, amused at my mistakes in ways that improve me. Once, arranging tools for a lesson, I counted their shadows on the wall and caught myself saying aloud, "Every good weapon leaves room for a question." I laughed and left the question unanswered on purpose. Students should learn to supply it. As for my friends, Wesley and Buttercup are not legend to me, but neighbours in the grammar of days. They come by the shop to trade gossip for twine. They argue amiably over who washes the pot. They have built a life that prefers competence to spectacle and joy to victory. She plants things that require patience. He reads weather with the attention of a man who has learned to be instructed by anything. Sometimes they quarrel a sharpness over a forgotten errand, an unbeautiful hour. They apologize in full sentences. That is all a happy ending is. Two people who know how to apologize and mean it. Fezzik writes badly and bravely from towns that have discovered his uses. Today, he reports, I moved a wagon from a mud sentence to a road paragraph, or taught a class to rhyme with kindness and only sometimes with sense. He ends every letter with an inventory of dogs he has met. When he visits, the shop grows larger without needing additions. If you listen closely, You can hear the kingdom repairing itself. A courthouse where names are spoken kindly. A school where children learn to hold tools and reasons in the same hand. A laboratory where the instruments now measure garden soil, and the only device saved from the old room is a bell used to call people to soup. And yes, somewhere a prince practices restraint, not because he has become good, perhaps, but because he has learned the cost of unexamined want. Civilization is not a choir of saints. It is a town square where fewer people are afraid. All of this is smaller than legend and larger than rumour. It is what craft calls fit. The way a blade sits in its scabbard, ready when asked, quiet when not. I still practice, I still teach. Sometimes I still duel, never for applause, always to prevent harm, and always with the politeness a blade deserves. When the work is done, I hang the sword and let the evening teach my hands to be empty. If you have walked beside me this far, you already own the only ending I can honestly offer. A room put back to rights. A vow spoken once, and then kept in maintenance rather than in fire. A friendship that outlives theatre. A name that does not need to be shouted to be true. My story is not a staircase now, but a path no trumpets, good shade, space for company. The lantern is nearly out, the bench is swept. I have put a single nail beside the quill, so that tomorrow will begin with something simple done well. If, on some future morning, a boy or girl knocks and asks to learn how not to drop themselves in a hard moment, I will show them how to breathe in 4 counts and stand where the ground agrees with their feet. We will speak the names of masters not as decorations, but as tools. We will laugh. We will make tea. And then I will close the door softly and let the house remember us. Listen only a whisper now. Take whatever of this is useful into your own rooms. Ask your work to be honest, your promises to be gentle, your love to be particular. Let endings teach you beginnings. The rest we will wander about together, quietly, with the lights down and the world, for once, uninclined to shove.